Yeah, thanks everyone for joining the Land Model Working Group at the CESM Workshop today. And we tried a number of kind of creative formats for this meeting. And today it's going to be speed dating because we had a number of talks and we elected to give everyone talks who requested them instead of having a few people relegated to posters. So it's going to be fast. Brace yourselves, and speakers, you'll get 10 minutes to present, and then we'll have a couple minutes as you transition to ask questions. And so, I think we're pretty good at Zoom etiquette by now, but please keep yourself muted while you're not presenting. And then if you do have questions, raise your hand or type it in the chat, and Jackie and Donica are going to help me out moderating the chat and kind of facilitating the meeting. So I wanted to go ahead and get started. And offer a few kind of just overview presentation of where the Land Model Working Group is headed in the next year, for the most part, like where we've been in the last year and where we're headed, but really leaving most of the science highlights for the talks that are coming up. So I look forward to the presentations that we have coming up this morning. This is a big list, and I'm not even going to try to go over it now. It's just to say that there's a lot of great work that's been put onto the main development branch of CTSM 5.1. And so if you're looking to start using new features of the model, it's probably a good time to switch if you haven't already, because we've accomplished quite a bit since the CLM-5 release, which was almost 3 years ago now. And one of the big things that's on this list that was mentioned yesterday in the software engineering talk, and that they'll talk again at the software engineering meeting tomorrow, is this new Nwopsi coupling. And so that basically replaces the MCT coupler, which was coupler 7. So you can think of Nwopsi as effectively being coupler 8. And the reason I bring this up is because MCT will be deprecated soon. It'll still be supported, for legacy tags of the model. But in moving to Nwopsi, there's a few things that I wanted to highlight. One is that ESMF libraries are required. Another important feature is that the mesh file replaces the domain file in your simulations. And then the control of a DATM has changed extensively, especially with things like user nameless DATM streams. And all of this, it really does facilitate single point simulations. Soon we'll have the capability to make regional simulations simpler, but I recognize that we still need, on the land model side, we still need some additional documentation. So we're working on that. If you're interested in hearing more about Nwopsi, Mariana's presenting tomorrow at 8:30 at the Software Engineering Working Group meeting. But there kind of continues to be a number of posts and questions and frustrations on the forums and on GitHub. So I just wanted to bring this up, that after DevTag 63, we've switched to Nwopsi. In terms of our development timeline, in 2018, we released CLM-5, and soon after that, CESM-2. And then kind of where we are here in summer 2022, they're about to make a CESM 2.3 tag relatively soon. I'm not exactly sure on the date. And then our target, and I'm calling this CESM 2.x, it's kind of a prequel to CESM 3, but that by next summer, we'll be testing out in the coupled model what will become CESM 3. So it won't be, CESM 3 won't be released next summer, but we're going to start testing coupled model configuration for that. So in the meantime, a number of things have come into the model already. So that includes things like biomass heat storage, this roughness length parameterization that's almost to main, a number of changes to phenology, fire, some bug fixes, the addition of FATES SP, as well as FATES regional and point capabilities that we'll talk about or hear about today, as well as the Nywon work. So a couple other features that are they're on domain, but still need some data sets to support them, are transient urban and shifting cultivation. So in the meantime, Daniel, Dave, and Katie have started the parameter perturbation experiment with the idea that we'll learn enough about the parameterization of CLM that we can hopefully tune the model for CTSM 6 and have it come back in. And then also there's a new branch that's been started, which is CTSM 5.2, which is just for surface data set updates. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there is a new branch out there for updating surface data sets. In the next year, there's a number of features that we're hoping to include in the model. So that includes things like Megan, new dust emissions and CAM lightning, as well as ozone deposition. There's a pull request for the representative hill slope model that Sean's working on, which we'll be excited to include, as well as the reservoir management options that we heard about yesterday. And Ms. Route hopefully coming in with those. Then FATES with land use change, FATES with fixed biogeography, and then kind of a full implementation of FATES, kind of TBD when that gets integrated into CTSM. And then the last couple of things on here are a switch to mimic soil biogeochemistry, updates to crop planting dates, and then potentially the APSIM crop model. So we'll hear about some crop updates today too. I wanted to highlight these CTSM 5.2 dev tag that, for the most part, just Mariana started working with us, or kind of building the capabilities for creating MIG-SURF data with ESMF, and then SAM is continuing that. I don't want to get a ton into the details here, other than creating MIG-SURF data with the ESMF regridding makes it much quicker. The mapping files don't have to be created as separate files, and it facilitates the creation of variable mesh and high resolution grids. So we'll have a lot more flexibility with CESM. We've also got this new transient urban data sets and gross unrepresented land use transitions that Peter's been working on. And then as well as dynamic lakes, updates to soil properties, irrigation methods, glacier fields, as well as potentially soil color and leaf area index. So the idea here is that CTSM 5.1 development will continue, and then we'll merge it. We'll kind of test the new surface data sets, understand how they're changing answers, and then merge those back to the trunk kind of together once we understand, both the science changes on the main development branch as well as the surface data set changes on this 5.2 branch. Given how much is happening in the working group, I'm excited that we've kind of started rolling out this new set of tutorials. So we had our first mini tutorial with CTSM 5.2, I'm sorry, with CTSM 5.1 a couple of weeks ago. This was facilitated by a ton of work from Megan, Adrianna, Brian Dobbins, Donica, and I. And so in doing this, all of the trainings we did with CESM Lab, which I expect us to be able to continue in the future. And then we have this set of notebooks laid out that I want to highlight a few of the capabilities here. There's examples for how to run supported Nywon tower sites as part of the Nywon project, as well as FATES global SP simulations, and then also a workflow for generic single point simulations that uses Nuopsy. And so all of this is kind of using some tools that are in CTSM tools, site and regional. So there's two new Python scripts there that Megan and Adrianna have worked on that are run Nywon and subset data. And then in this tutorial, there's also notebooks on looking at how to visualize results and analyze model output. So all these notebooks are rendered and available online, and I'd encourage folks to take a look at those. Those are meant to be a resource so that, if you or your students are working on some of these new capabilities, we'd like you to start using these tools. And then lastly, I'd like to request that you ask for additional topics. And so, regional cases are one that I think will be hopefully rolling out before too long. But if there's features in the model that you'd like to learn about, let us know, and we can hopefully create some of these tutorials that are relatively short and modular to highlight different capabilities in CTSM. Just in the kind of closing, this is another list of all of the development goals that we have for CTSM 6. It's relatively short, and I have this up here mostly as a resource so that if you're curious about what's coming on and what's coming to Maine, many of these have pull requests that are associated with them, and you can kind of follow along with your favorite development plans or activities that are happening in the model. I think I did it in 10 minutes. Shocking.
You're good. You actually have another, you have another minute, 30 seconds if you.
I could have taken a couple more breaths. That's okay. I'll go ahead and stop sharing if you want to go ahead and share your screen, Jackie. And if folks have questions,
Sure.
go ahead and raise your hand or drop them in the chat.
Okay, well, I could start a little bit early.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. All right. Can you can see my slides and you can hear me?
Yep. Looks
Okay,
good.
great. Thanks. So I'm Jacquelyn Shuman. I'll be talking about FATES, the functionally assembled terrestrial ecosystem simulator. I want to emphasize that FATES is very much a community effort, and it would not be possible without the large team and the very many outside collaborators, specifically Charlie Coven, Rosie Fisher, and Ryan Knox. So this is not just a reflection of my work. Okay, there we go. So FATES is a cohort model. It fundamentally does vegetation differently than the standard hostland model. It can run within CLM or ELM. FATES represents mixes of different types of vegetation using a count to represent the density of a particular type of vegetation of a particular size. On a grid cell, you have multiple times sense disturbance. And so you can have, within a grid cell, you can represent a newly disturbed patch all the way up to a mature old growth forest. And so you have different collections of vegetation competing with one another in space that changes through time. And so FATES has variability. And with that variability, you get different interactions with the atmosphere, you get different vulnerabilities of the vegetation, and so you get different dynamics. It also allows us a more realistic connection to data. This is important because if you look globally, degradation and forest change are an important component driving CO2 emissions, as well as land atmosphere fluxes. Forest degradation specifically drives emissions. Deforestation, mainly from South America and Southeast Asia, is the largest contributor for deforestation. Fires from temperate and boreal regions also are a large contributor. And so FATES is able to represent both of these processes, which are inherently size related. If we look specifically at the Amazon in Brazil, the Amazon has been a net carbon emitter for many years. And this picture shows you the change in source versus sink. And so there's a difference in the strength of the source or the strength of the sink. And a lot of this has to do with, if you look at the map, you can see that these are very fine scale changes reaching into old growth forest. So the structure of the forest changes, the function of the forest changes, and that impacts vulnerability. A model like FATES is better able to capture these fine scale changes. In the boreal region, we have a different dynamic happening with warmer temperatures. Increased productivity and altered structure has the capacity to change the way the boreal regions look. On the left, we have increases in greening shown across the tundra. This increase in productivity is something that's going to change the height and types of vegetation. On the right, we have the extent of the tundra taiga ecotone. As we have changes in productivity, we can potentially get advancement of trees into this area shown in pink is the diffuse taiga. And so if we get advancement or an increase in the density of trees, that's going to change the interaction with the atmosphere for these regions. And so there are a lot of instances in reality where structure is an essential part of the process. And so with FATES, we have a better ability to capture this interaction of structure and the necessity of structure. And so within FATES, we've had a lot of development. I'm going to talk about a lot of these today. One thing that I don't have a specific slide on is our updates within fire. We will have a talk about live fuel moisture today, and but I've done development adding crown fire with Sam Levis, and then we're doing testing with Polly Biot to add a more mechanistic implementation of crown fire, which is also very much size related. So globally, we've been running FATES. Adrianna Foster will talk about reduced complexity modes, early PPE testing with FATES SP. FATES is running. You can run FATES globally with fixed biogeography. We're doing diagnostic testing with the ILAM framework. We'll hear a talk today about a global implementation of land cover land use change. And then regionally, I've been doing testing looking at fire vegetation climate feedbacks. And so this is with full complexity. And so through the interaction of these feedbacks, we're able to dynamically assemble a realistic ecosystem with reasonable biomass accumulation. I'm not going to talk about that today, but we will see a talk by Polly Biot about an application in California. Within nutrient dynamics, we have a new optimization routine coming online. Nutrients are fully operational within a fully coupled E3SM. We're working on that on the CLM side. And so this optimization routine allows for difference in the amount of roots, respiration, and nutrient uptake. And the exciting thing about this is that you have plasticity depending on whether you're in the understory or canopy. And so you get variability in these roots. And so the plants are responding to this dynamic light environment. We also have a lot of updates with hydraulics, Yilin Fang and Junyan Ding. We have two types of solvers depending on the level of accuracy you want or where you're testing. We have variable fine root layering, updated pressure volume, pressure conductance. As the plants grow in size, you get a variation in rooting depth. You also get leaf stomatal humidity that acts as a control on transpiration. A group in Norway has implemented and is testing a moss implementation. And so you see a representation of that on the left. You have moss as a vegetation layer, as well as moss as a soil layer. And you can see that moss acts as a control on soil temperature, shown here in the top. And then moss is fundamentally different than grass. So grass is shown here in the orange line, moss is the red and the blue. And so having an improved representation of moss compared to actual data will be important for the model. Marcus Longo is working to incorporate and test drought deciduous phenology. This is important across areas such as the Amazon. You have a pronounced rainfall gradient, and across that gradient, you have variation in the amount of evergreen versus deciduous trees. And so early testing indicates that you can get coexistence of deciduous and evergreen in both wet and dry forests. But as a drought comes through, you lose evergreen cohorts, shown here on the bottom left. And so this drought deciduous phenology is a survival strategy that it is important to capture as we move to more droughts and drier conditions in the tropics. Adrianna Foster is working on single point simulations at NEON sites, ecological observatory sites across the United States. She's taking existing LiDAR data and hyperspectral imagery to classify these sites, initialize them to current stands, and then using parameter calibration and Bayesian statistical methods to optimize her allometry parameterization. She's also using these sites to look at characterizing roughness and canopy height based on the mixed vegetation. And so that is in early stages, shown here at the bottom. Julin Gao from Berkeley is working to update allometry and phenology for grasses in California. And so using fitted allometry and adjusted phenology, they're able to capture the magnitude and seasonal variation in GPP for sites in California. And then she's supporting this with grass allometry greenhouse experiments that will expand the types of grasses that we can characterize. Joshua Rady has implemented a vegetation, or has created a vegetation management module that can function with FATES, and it has more specific functionality compared to the existing logging module. And so this is an example. We have site level results at the bottom, and then he's applied it across a region for the southeastern United States. And so you can see that changes in CO2, as well as changes in the forcing scenario. This is RCP 2.6. This is RCP 8.5. It creates a difference in the amount of harvest that is available to the system. Finally, Adam Hanbury-Brown had a set of really nice papers that came out in New Phytologist. One was a review of regeneration routines used in vegetation demographic models. And then this paper looked at the implementation of a tree recruitment scheme to better represent regeneration and transitions between young seedlings to saplings. And so the implementation of this TRS scheme in ED2 improved the magnitude and rank of the simulation compared to observations shown here sort of in the middle. And so this routine is well positioned to be implemented within FATES, and it has the capacity to improve our projections for the future. And so that's planned for this year.
Jackie, that is 10 minutes.
Thank you. This is my last slide. And so on the FATES side, Greg Lemieux has updated our technical documentation and our user's guide, so it's searchable, which is a nice change. That's available at the website listed at the top. And then, as Will said, there are tutorial materials that include specific activities for FATES, and that website is listed here at the bottom. And so I want to acknowledge the DOE for their funding support of FATES. And if anyone has questions about FATES or would like to get involved, I'd encourage you to get in touch. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. Any questions for Jackie on FATES developments?
Jackie, there's a question in the chat from Betty that asks, can one change the plant traits PFTs for much different plants in deeper paleoclimate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so you can define PFTs within FATES as you desire. You are not restricted to FATES or PFTs as they're defined by either CLM or an existing implementation. And so you can increase the number of plant functional types, and they can use unique allometry. The challenges with paleo implementations would be figuring out how to parameterize. And so can you use modern plants to represent these ancient plants? But yes, absolutely, you have the possibility to choose your own adventure with FATES. And Lara Kippers, I want to note that the Adam Hanbury's tree recruitment scheme is within FATES, but it needs testing. And so I misspoke there.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jackie. And I see that there's also a question for Adrian. It looks like we have 1 minute before Daniel's talk. But that question looks like it's potentially more directed towards Will, wondering about the difference between the grid and the mesh files. So Will, I don't know if you
Sure.
have an
Daniel,
answer.
you can go ahead and start sharing your screen. But the quick answer, Adrian, is that we have a get regional script that subsets the mesh file for a kind of standard resolution run that is almost to main. I think there's still a few little testing things that need to get worked out, but that regional capability for running with Nywon is pretty much functional and almost tested well enough that we can release it. So
Right. And both Marisa and Adrian have asked about documentation for this, and so that's something we should consider as well.
Yep. Yeah, hopefully we'll have a tutorial relatively soon on running a regional case. I know that's something that lots of people are interested in. Cool.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Daniel Kennedy, who's going to be talking about the CLM-5 parameter perturbation experiment. Go ahead, Daniel.
Right, so you can see my screen and hear me okay?
Yep, that's good.
All right, so I'll be talking about the CLM-5 parameter perturbation experiment. We've been working on this for about the last year or so. And we're working on quantifying parametric uncertainty and working towards automated calibration of CLM-5 and specifically the biogeochemistry version of CLM-5. So our goals are comprehensive parameter uncertainty assessment and calibration but likewise to kind of build up infrastructure to make parameter perturbation experiments easier and to kind of automate objective parameter estimation. Likewise, we want to explore sensitivity of a range of features of global land system to reasonable uncertainty in model parameter values. For the land, this is especially important because we know, or we think that model uncertainty has a lot to do with parametric uncertainty. And for me, one of the things I'm especially interested in is water use efficiency. You can see that CLM has had big changes in water use efficiency from model to model, or from across the different versions of the model. So why is this important? There's a really large influence of carbon cycle uncertainty on climate projections. So this is a plot from the CMIP5 ensemble, showing the spread across a suite of climate models in terms of the integrated terrestrial carbon sink, or up to the 21st century. So the spread among the models is approximately 100 years of current fossil fuel emissions. And you can see that the models don't actually even agree whether the land will be a source or a sink through to the 21st century, right? So this set of models has the land as a sink, and this set of models, two of which use CLM4, have the land as a source of carbon. So since then, CMIP6 experiment was completed, and this is a kind of similar experiment and similar plot. And now we find that the next generation of models do agree on the sign, where all the modeling centers have the land acting as a sink of carbon, but the spread among models is roughly equivalent. So what I'm interested in is, how does a single model like CLM's parametric uncertainty compare to the multi-model spread? If we sample a reasonable set of parameter values, would we get a small uncertainty cone around our model, smaller than the spread, or would we get a really large uncertainty cloud that's larger than the spread among the models? So this kind of sets up our experiment, CLM5 parameter perturbation experiment, and our objectives: discern parameter sensitivities across a range of processes, quantify uncertainty, and hopefully automate model calibration by facilitating easier PPEs with a generalizable workflow. So some of the infrastructure developments, there are approximately 200 parameters in CLM5. And so Keith and Sam and Katie worked on identifying and extracting all of the CLM5 BGC parameters. So that involved identifying all the parameters, moving any hard-coded parameters to the parameter file, and then we even created some new parameters, for example, stuff that had to do with the perturbing the surface data set. So sand perturbation factor makes soils, more or less sandy. Then once we had those 200 parameters, we did a sort of like group think approach to setting parameter ranges. No one person really knows every domain of the model. So we created a Google spreadsheet and worked to kind of fill out reasonable ranges. And we found this is a useful way to kind of approach this, and having the infrastructure to read directly from the Google spreadsheets has been nice to create a perturbation experiment. But then in terms of automated calibration, CLM BGC calibration is very difficult. It's multi-objective, a very large and complex parameter space, and likewise the model is expensive. You can ask Dave, Rosie, Will, etc. They tried automated calibration for CLM5 and it didn't quite work, and then they were left in the lurch kind of at the 11th hour. And so when I say the model is expensive, if you work with other components of CESM, you might think the land is cheap, and it is relatively cheap per simulated year, but the BGC model requires greater than 1,000 years to spin up the geochemistry, which makes it expensive per simulation. So if you imagine you were going to spend 2 million PE hours, that's how much computer time you're willing to spend, you would only get about 5 simulations of the BGC model if you were running at 1 degree resolution, which is not enough to do any sort of meaningful calibration. And so cost management was a big part of the work that we had to do. So a 1 degree simulation requires 21,000 grid cells, and then 2 degree simulation, you get, you only need about a quarter of that, 5,600. But what's been shown is that a small set of grid cells can reasonably replicate global mean, standard deviation, and transient model output. So Forrest Hoffman and Nate Collier helped by doing a clustering analysis to find a representative set of 400 grid cells that could do a good job at representing global dynamics and all of the variables that we're interested in. And this provides basically a 50 times speed up relative to the 1 degree simulations. Another 10x speed up came from the CN matrix routines, which uses linearization of the BGC dynamics, excuse me, to speed up spin up. And so now, instead of 5 simulations with 2 million PE hours, we can get about 3,000 simulations. And this is available kind of on the PPE development branch. So this was, without this, we weren't going to be able to do any sort of meaningful parameter experiments. And so our experiment is to do all 200 parameters, perturbing them one at a time, a high value and a low value, for about 400 simulations. Each simulation is independently spun up for 140 years using that CN matrix. And then we're doing a 10-year steady experiment cycling over 2005 to 2014 with reanalysis forcing. Why one at a time? So it yields an easy to interpret data set. And we knew that many of the parameters will have very small effect on the variables we're interested in. And Latin hypercube of 200 parameters was pretty intimidating. And what I mean by that is we weren't sure that we would get meaningful or diagnosable results out of that. So we wanted to start with one at a time and then proceed on to sort of a multi-factor experiment. So this shows across the ensemble, approximately 400 members, what the effect on GPP is. And you can see here, not many, a lot of them don't have much effect, and it becomes more obvious when I sort the ensemble members. 2/3 of the parameters have less than 1% effect on GPP, and even 8 of the parameter perturbations were bit for bit, which means that those parameters were probably deprecated and had something to do with CLM4 and not CLM5. So this is a nice step, one at a time ensemble. So we did it for that control climate, but then we repeated it for 5 other kind of scenario type experiments. So one was low CO2, one was high CO2, and then separately we did, modern or present day year 2000 CO2, but pre-industrial climate and SSP climate from the future. And then we did a nitrogen enhancement, so increased nitrogen deposition by 5 grams per meter squared. And it's important to do this for us when we're trying to tune the model, because we need to make sure that any parameterization that we choose can survive spin up. So that's why you need to try low CO2 in pre-industrial climate. But we also want to make sure that we're including and learning about any parameters that might not be super important for present day, but are really important in the future. So things like CO2 fertilization. So once we did this one at a time ensemble, we ended up making a lot of lists that look like this: which parameters have the largest effect on GPP? And I'm showing just 3 out of the 6 experiments. And if I highlight the top, you can see that the top 3 parameters here kind of show up across in a different order. So plant hydraulics parameter, leaf carbon nitrogen, and then the Medlin intercept. So top 3 are the same, but for example, with the high CO2, now, nitrogen fixation becomes really important to maintain your photosynthesis. And so the fun frac fixers, which has to do with that, becomes important. So that kind of shows.
Daniel, that's 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so let me just go through this and then I'll take questions. Or actually, I can skip this. So coming out of this, we're going to do a LAI calibration experiment where we're subsetting 25 parameters for a multi-factor ensemble using Latin hypercube sampling applied to transient climate forcing, where we'll have to define some objective function for tuning the model, find optimal parameter sets, and then we expect to run an ensemble of reasonable parameterizations into the future to try and understand the uncertainty. And then, so that's upcoming. And then there are a lot of coordinated PPE projects that are all super exciting. University of Washington, they're doing land atmosphere interactions, FATES, Adrianna will talk next, and then there's a bunch more here, which I can share, but we're really excited and hope that some of the infrastructure that we're developing can be useful for coordinated experiments. So I'll leave this up, but take any questions if there are. I don't know.
We're at the out of time, but I think in the chat, if folks have questions, you can drop them in for Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel, if you could stop sharing and then we'll let Adrianna get started.
Yeah, and while we're switching screens, there's a question for you in the chat, Daniel, from Adrian. Can you share a link of this Google spreadsheet parameter list you just showed us?
Yeah, I'll put them in the chat.
And so now we'll switch over to Adrianna Foster, who will be presenting on CLM-FATES PPE, the first steps in the calibration cascade. Adrianna, we can see your screen. I do not see you, and I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, great. Cool. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so thanks, Daniel. I'm gonna follow up with sort of it's definitely right now the initial stages, but following on Daniel's and the rest of the CLM PPE team's efforts, I'm doing a CLM-FATES PPE. And so, yeah, so Jackie gave a great overview of FATES, but just to remind everyone, FATES is a vegetation demographics model. It operates within CLM, or you can also run it within ELM. But this means that it breaks vegetation up by cohorts of similar size in PFT. The cohorts grow on and die on patches of a similar age. And then we have atmospheric fluxes like in CLM that are simulated very quickly. And then the plant growth and allocation occurs on a daily time step. And so why does this matter? And so with a model like FATES, we're necessarily in the business of capturing ecological processes across multiple scales. So we've got those cell level processes of photosynthesis, leaf level processes of stomatal conductance and impact on boundary layer dynamics. And then with FATES, we have tree and stand level processes like allocation and competition. And then at the landscape scale, we might be interested in some kind of emergent process like fur waves that you can see here. And this is a result of all of these multi-scale interactive processes. And then at the same time, we're experiencing a boom in remote sensing technology advancements, allowing for high resolution observations of vegetation characteristics and state. And so we have things like JEDI, which looks at either biomass or stand structure, eco-stress for things like plant stress, and OCO3 for SIF. And so we can use these really high resolution observations to calibrate FATES at high resolution as well. However, because of FATES multi-scale nature and the fact that these scales often interact non-linearly with one another, it can be really difficult to calibrate across all of these scales at once without kind of hyper-tuning into some rabbit hole. So for example, while trying to calibrate output of, say, GPP or transpiration, we also have to ensure we're accurately capturing leaf area, stand structure, recruitment and mortality, as well as PFT composition. And so ideally, we'd like to be able to control for some of these processes while we aim to better parameterize and calibrate others. And in FATES, we do have the ability to control for these different complex processes. So the FATES team has been working on developing these reduced complexity modes for FATES. So with satellite phenology mode, much like in the CLM BGC SP mode, we use observed LAI over time for each PFT, and then each PFT consists of one cohort on one patch. And so here we're essentially turning off growth, disturbance, and mortality. In no competition or no comp mode, PFTs are given a fixed area to grow, but do not compete with one another. In prescribed biogeography mode, we allow for growth, disturbance, and competition between PFTs, but we restrict PFT establishment and growth to where those PFTs actually occur on the globe. And then finally, we have full fates mode with all of these levers on. And thanks to Charlie for lending me these cool cartoons that he made. And so these different modes allow us to calibrate different processes and parameters within the model. So with SP mode, we can test photosynthesis and leaf and hydrology parameters. In no comp mode, we can test allometry and allocation, as well as mortality. And with fixed biogeography, we can test environmental sensitivity and competition for resources. And so the FATES team, and namely Rosie Fisher and Charlie Coven, have been developing this concept of a calibration cascade to test various parts and parameters within the model using these different reduced complexity modes. So the idea being that the model would be improved with each subsequent calibration step, and with lots of going back and probably redoing steps as necessary to ensure that the model is calibrated accurately but robustly. And so this first calibration step is in SP mode. And one of our initial questions is, what parameters are actually important in SP mode? And that's kind of where this FATES SP perturbed parameter experiment comes into play. And so the objectives of this first step are to check on which parameters have any amount of impact in SP mode, as well as to determine the importance of these parameters. And so very luckily, I'm able to borrow heavily from the CLM-PPE methodology that Daniel just described. Excuse me. So initially, I conducted similarly a one at a time min-max parameter ensemble. So running a simulation with a min and a max for each parameter value. I also used this sparse grid to save on computation time. So again, these 400 grid cells were chosen based on representativeness and responsiveness to climate and environmental change. And then for each simulation, I spun up the model, cycling 2004 to 2015 GSWP3 climate until a total ecosystem water storage came into equilibrium. And so this is faster than what Daniel was describing because this is SP mode. And then I used the last, excuse me, 20 years of parameter sensitivity for the parameter sensitivity analysis. So for this test, I looked at all FATES parameters, excluding those related to FATES hydro, fire, and logging, because those are not active. And so all told, this was 117 parameters, which included those related to photosynthesis, radiation, phenology, allometry, and demographics like mortality and recruitment. Now, because we're in SP mode, I actually expect most of these parameters to have absolutely no effect on model output. And I really only expected those parameters related to photosynthesis, leaf traits, and radiation to be impactful in this mode. But again, we kind of just wanted to do a sanity check to make sure that this was the case. So of these 170 parameters I ran, only 36 had an impact in SP mode. And as for impact, I was looking at history output of GPP, transpiration, soil temperature, soil moisture, and albedo. Excuse me. So as I expected, most of the important parameters had to do with leaf traits and radiation, with some allometry parameters showing up. Though these were very minimally impactful. And then just note, I did have one fail that I'm still working on. The leaf stem orientation index failed when I tried to increase it. So this is something that I will need to go back and figure out, because I do think that this parameter will be important. And so here is grid cell average GPP across all of the parameter simulations that had any impact. And so I'm showing the annual average on the left and the interannual variability on the right. So there are quite a few that only slightly modify GPP, but we do have some outliers. So here, for example, is VC max. The clumping index is also pretty impactful. And then these theta CJ curvature parameters also show up. Sorry. Excuse me. Similarly, here is grid cell average annual latent heat flux with the standout parameters related to stomatal slope and intercept. And this all makes quite a bit of sense. So GPP is most impacted by photosynthesis and leaf traits. Latent heat flux is really highly influenced by stomatal conductance. But I wanted to have a metric that would show the effect of each parameter, but that was not impacted by the units of the history variable or the units of the parameter. So here I looked at the relative change in the history variable, that is the output at the max minus the min divided by the average, as well as the relative change in the parameter value. And then I just divided those two to get sort of this parameter effect. So here are the top 20 parameters based on this effect metric for GPP. Again, here we see mostly leaf and radiation parameters. It's a similar story for transpiration with stomatal slope at the top, followed by some other leaf trait parameters. And for albedo, it's not surprising that the top parameters are mostly those related to radiation. And so we did have some overlap, excuse me, in the top few parameters. So here are the top 5 parameters across GPP, latent heat flux, albedo, soil moisture, and soil temperature. And so many of these parameters were in the top few for multiple history variables. So now what? Okay, so essentially the idea would be now to implement calibration using these top N parameters. I'm not sure how many we should start with at first, but this is something I'll be working on with feedback from the FATES team and the CLM PPE team. And the idea would be to calibrate against outputs of GPP, albedo, transpiration, and other fluxes. Now, something I didn't talk about was that many of the important parameters were actually PFT specific, meaning that each PFT has its own value. And in these simulations, I change them all at once, but during calibration, we'll likely need to calibrate them separately. However, this will greatly increase the number of simulations needed if each PFT parameter combo is considered separately. So one thing that the CLM PPE is looking into is seeing where PFTs overlap and whether they can run, completely non-overlapping PFTs at the same time to save on computation. So for example, we may be able to calibrate Arctic plants and C4 grasses at the same time. And so ultimately, this is just the initial
Adrianna,
steps.
we should probably wrap up there.
Thanks.
There's 30 more seconds, Will.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, ultimately, this is just the initial steps in the planned FATES calibration cascade, of which the ultimate goal is a globally calibrated and robust FATES in full FATES mode. And yeah, thank you. So apologies for all the coughing.
That's awesome.
That's okay.
Thanks, Adrianna.
You did great. Thanks, Adrianna. Next up, we're going to have Katya Jay presenting on simulation of Alpine Tundra communities along an environmental gradient within CLM-5 at the Niwot Ridge LTER. Katya, we can see your screen. You're not in presentation mode yet. There you go. Okay. I cannot hear you, but whenever you're...
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself.
There you go. Okay.
Thanks, Jackie. All right, like Jackie said, we'll be switching gears a little bit to talk about some single point work, simulating Alpine Tundra communities at Niwot Ridge. And before I get into that, I just want to quickly acknowledge my funding sources and my co-authors who have contributed to this work, both from CU and from NCAR. And I've had a lot of help on the modeling side, so that's been really great. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Niwot Ridge, it's a long-term ecological research site located in the Colorado Front Range. And the site has a long history of measurements going back to the 1980s, including things like vegetation, snow depth, soil properties, freshwater lakes, and a lot of other things. And it also has a flux tower that's been active since 2008, that you can see in this photo here, known as TVAN. And this, because it's a high alpine environment, it has a lot of complex topography. So there's a lot of microscale variation across the landscape due to differences in wind and snow. And the site also has a long climate record going all the way back to the 1950s. So you can see in this plot up here on the right, there's a record of annual maximum temperatures at an alpine and subalpine site over the last 70 years. And you can see that we have a rapid warming trend over this time period. So we know that this site is really spatially variable and also rapidly changing, which makes it especially interesting to study from a modeling perspective. So we're interested in understanding how differences in the physical template in this alpine environment drive changes in plant productivity, soil moisture, and phenology. And then also in understanding how these changes can vary spatially across north and south aspects. And the hill slope model, which was developed by Sean Swenson, is a really useful tool for addressing these kinds of questions because we can examine variability at hill slope scales where we have multiple columns in a hill slope that are connected by this downslope lateral flow, and we can also examine the effects of aspect using downscaled meteorology. So in this photo here, you can see our representative hill slope at Niwot Ridge, which is this area known as the saddle. And it has 3 distinct tundra vegetation communities as a result of differences in exposure through wind and aspect, and then resulting differences in snow accumulation. So in the background here in the snow-covered area, you can see what's known as the moist meadow. And this is an east-facing area that accumulates a lot of snow. And this photo is taken in late June, so you can see the snow is melting out pretty late. In contrast to in the foreground here, you can see the dry meadow community, which is much drier and rockier with small statured vegetation and is a really windblown environment, so it doesn't tend to accumulate a lot of snow. And then this lowland area where you can see some shrubs in the middle is the wet meadow. And we tend to have kind of a continuum of different types of plant growth strategies with more resource acquisitive plants in the wetter environments, and then plants that are more stress tolerant and have more conservative growth strategies in the dry meadow. Just to kind of give a quick overview of our model setup, we have, like I said, we have a lot of site input data coming from Niwot Ridge. So things like precipitation from the saddle and meteorology from the flux tower, as well as radiation data from an Ameriflux tower. And then we also have 3 different parameterizations to kind of simulate these 3 different communities. We created 3 different Arctic C3 grass PFTs using various observations of foliar traits and phenology from these different environments, then also by modifying other model parameters such as plant hydrology parameters, plant hydraulics, sorry. And then, like I said, we have a lot of data sets that we can evaluate the model results with. So things like snow depth and soil temperature and moisture, productivity, and flux tower data. So I won't have too much time to go into detail, but I'm going to kind of skip to model evaluation, starting with snow depth. So in these plots, you'll see all of the model results in red and the observations in black. And these are averaged over the last 12 years that we have data from. So moist meadow is on top, wet meadow in the middle, and dry meadow on the bottom. And you can see that we have this gradient of snow accumulation where the moist meadow has a pretty large snowpack, and then the dry meadow has almost no snow in the winter, but a little bit more snow in the spring, which is because it tends to get wetter, heavier snow that doesn't blow away as much in the spring. And then also just to note that the observations we have from the snow depth are really variable between years and over time. But you can see that we're doing a pretty good job of capturing the magnitude and timing of snowmelt in these communities. So now looking at soil temperature, these plots are showing you soil temperature kind of along this gradient of snow accumulation, so from moist to dry communities. And overall, you can see the differences between the communities. So the dry meadow soils are a lot warmer during the growing season compared to the other 2, and colder in the winter. So that's due to the buffering effects of snow, especially in the moist meadow. You can see that it's hovering right below freezing in the winter, and then is also warming up much later, so around day 150 versus the dry meadow that starts to warm up around day 100. But overall, we're doing a pretty good job of capturing these patterns in temperature. Now looking at soil moisture, these plots on the x-axis are clipped just to show where soils were above freezing. And we can see that the model is doing a pretty good job of capturing soil moisture patterns throughout the growing season in the moist meadow. But we've had a lot of trouble kind of capturing both this early season peak and then this dry down that occurs in the dry meadow due to some issues with soil moisture and productivity feedback. So that's something I've been working on, but still having some issues in the dry meadow. So as a result of these physical differences, we see differences in growing season length and productivity in these different plant communities. This top plot is showing you leaf area index, So with wet meadow in blue, dry meadow in orange, and moist meadow in green. You can see the dry meadow has the longest growing season, the moist meadow has the shortest. And then this bottom plot is showing above ground NPP, again with observations from some biomass clip harvests in black. So you can see that we're doing a good job of kind of simulating a cooler, wetter, more productive community versus a hotter, drier, less productive community. Although our above ground NPP values are a bit low compared to the observations. So we know that aspect is really important in the Alpine. So we were interested in looking at what would happen if we simulated these communities on north and south facing aspects. And to provide a little bit more context, they're conducting a turf transplant field experiment in the coming years up at Niwot Ridge, where they're going to be digging up blocks of tundra and transplanting them across macro and microsite gradients. So you can see in this diagram, kind of the macrosite is from cold to warm. So that would be across different aspects and elevations. And then the microsite is this hill slope gradient that I've been talking about. But these model results can hopefully kind of help inform both the setup of the experiment and also potential findings. So for this work, we put all three of the communities on a north aspect with a slope of 0.3 and on a south aspect with a slope of 0.3. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of show some soil results from this aspect work. So soil temperature is on the top and soil moisture on the bottom in these plots. And in all of these plots, the north aspects have the darker colored lines. And again, going from moist to wet to dry meadow. And you can see that overall the south aspects are significantly warmer and drier, especially in the dry meadow on average over the year. The south aspect was 2.4 degrees warmer, whereas in the moist meadow, it was 1.3 degrees warmer, and in the wet meadow, 1.7 degrees. But one thing that's interesting to note is that the timing of when these communities are, or when that south aspect is warmer kind of differs by community. So you can see in the moist meadow during the winter, there are very few differences, but then during the growing season, the south aspect is much warmer. Whereas in the dry meadow, it's the other way around, where in the winter, the south aspects are warmer, but then the differences are smaller during the growing season. So this kind of suggests that there are historical differences. We know that there are historical differences in snow accumulation in these communities, and that will moderate how these communities are experiencing warming in the future across different aspects, and kind of showing the buffering effects of snow. So I know I'm almost out of time, so I'm not going to read through these in the interest of time, but thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Katya, right on time.
Yeah, thanks, Katya. And so if you could go ahead and stop sharing, then Sanjeev is going to do the next presentation for Montasir Maruf on the Nywon testbed. But if we do have a minute where if someone wants to ask a question for Katya, you can ask that now, or you can put it into the chat. Okay, Katya, you have a question from Laura. Katya, you mentioned buffering effects of snow. Laura is wondering if the aspect with less winter snow has colder soil temperatures. And then
yes, so less winter snow would be the south aspect in the dry meadow. Or if it has colder soil temperatures in the south aspect, is that what you're wondering?
Sorry, yes, I was just wondering if in the winter you get this flip between colder temperatures in the site with less snow and then warmer temperatures in the summer, if that's the more exposed site.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good question.
The radiation.
The south aspect still had warmer soils in the winter.
Yeah, and I guess I was just wondering if that's represented if that's realistic in the real world or not, if you would expect more colder temperatures where there's less snow, if that's making sense.
In general, yes, but I think since the south aspect is receiving more radiation, I would kind of expect it to be a little bit warmer. Those differences in snow weren't very large just because it had so little snow to begin with. So I think that's why we're seeing that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Katya. Thanks, Laura, for that question. And sorry, I misspoke. Montasir Maruf will be presenting on a Nywon testbed for high resolution climate data assessment. Montasir, we can see your screen. Can you test your audio?
Can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Montasir Maruf. I'm a PhD student in Art System and Science at Auburn University, and my supervisor is Dr. Sanjeev Kumar. Today, I would like to update about our research titled "A Nywon Testbed for High Resolution Climate Assessment." Here is the outline for today's presentation. Today, I will talk about our research hypothesis, model description and procedure, our results, and a brief discussion about the results. So here is our research hypothesis. The high resolution model improves the accuracy of the water cycle prediction. So high resolution models gives more accurate water cycle prediction. The high resolution topography, land use, land management, and boundary condition improves the land model's output. So in order to test that hypothesis, we evaluate our model result with Meadow, LARI, and ERA5. Here is the model description. So for our model, NOAA, MP, and CLM high resolution, we used 12.5 kilometer as a spatial resolution. And for the CLM with low resolution, we use 100 kilometer. The analysis period is 1980 to 2018 for all the three models, and we used Annual forcing for all three models. Now the reference data set. The Meadow is 50 kilometer, LARI is 1 kilometer, and ERA5 is 10 kilometer. The temporal resolution of Meadow is 1980 to 2018, LARI is 2000 to 2018, and ERA5 is 1980 to 2018. So to evaluate our model, we compared the ETJJA, normalized root mean square, and correlation with Meadow, LARI, and ERA5. We also compared the sensible heat flux JJA, normalized root mean square, and correlation with Meadow and ERA5. And we also compared the residence time with ERA5. So this is the ET comparison for all the 6 models. The top 3 are our CLM high resolution, NOAA, MP, and CLM 1 degree, and the bottom 3 are LARI, ET, Meadow, and ERA5. So we can see that CLM high resolution and NOAA MP captures well in there in Southern California ET, whereas the CLM 1 degree, the Southern California ET is a little bit off. Also, the CLM high resolution NOAA MP is very close to LARI ET. If we talk about the spatial resolution. So this is the Taylor diagram for normalized root mean square and correlation for ETJJ. Here we can see that the first picture is ERA5 comparison. Here we can see that the axial axis is normalized root mean square, and the radial axis is correlation. So in the first diagram is ERA5, and we can see that CLM high resolution has a better correlation than CLM 1 degree. In ERA5, in the first diagram, CLM high resolution correlation is 0.98, whereas the low resolution is 0.97. In the second diagram is the Meadow. Here you can see that CLM high resolution correlation is 0.93, whereas the CLM low resolution is 0.92. And the third one is the levy. Here also we can see that CLM high resolution correlation is 0.94, and whereas CLM low resolution correlation is 0.93. So in all the models, CLM high resolution got much better correlation than the CLM high resolution. Also, NOAA-MP performs well in terms of correlation and normalized root mean square error. This is the temporal average for all the 17 ecoregions, and that is only for ERA5. Here we can see that all the three regions, which are 3, 4, and 8. These three regions simulated well in CLM high resolution than the CLM low resolution. In CLM low resolution, we can see that ecoregions 3, 7, and 8 got the correlation less than 0.3, and 4 got the correlation is 0.4, less than 0.4. Whereas CLM high resolution, these three ecoregions improves much better. The correlation is greater than 0.3 and 0.4. And overall, all the ecoregions simulated well in CLM high resolution than the CLM low resolution. All the ecoregions get slightly higher correlation and lower normalized root mean square error in CLM high resolution models. So this is the NRMSCN correlation comparison for the sensible heat flux JJ for META and ERA5. Here you can see that NOAA-MP and CLM high resolution got higher correlation. The higher correlation and lower normalized root mean square error than the CLM low resolution models. So this is applicable for both ERA5 and META2. In META2, NOAA-MP performs much better than the CLM high resolution and CLM low resolution. Yeah, it got relatively high correlation than the other two models. So this is a residence time spatial comparison with all the four models and ERA5. So here we can see that the dry regions like Southwest United States gets relatively higher residence time in CLM high resolution than the CLM low resolution. If you see these regions get higher residence time than the CLM low resolution, and also ecoregions 8 got higher higher soil moisture residence time value than the CLM low resolution. Also, from this picture, we can see that CLM high resolution captures well, and it's very close to our reference data set ERA5, whereas CLM high resolution and NOAA-MP is slightly off than our observed reference data set. So this is a normalized root mean score and correlation comparison for the residence time. Here we can see that CLM high resolution comparatively get better correlation, which is 0.98, whereas CLM low resolution got 0.94 as a correlation. So CLM high resolution performs really well in soil moisture residence time compared to the other models. So these are key findings we got from our research. So CLM high resolution provides more consistent output for ETN residence time compared to the other models. And also NOAA-MP provides better result for the sensible heat flux compared to the other two models. So the residence time has increased in the high resolution models than the low resolution models, and high resolution model is very close to the reference data set ERA5. So we conclude that better ETN water cycle prediction improves the soil moisture residence time for the high resolution models. we are grateful to the USDA for their support in this project. So that's all from me. And if anyone has any questions, I would like to take that. Thank you.
Thanks, Montasir. You're right on schedule. We have a minute for questions if anyone would like to ask one live. Otherwise, we can share those in the chat. Okay, Montasir, can you stop sharing? And so while we wait for questions, we will switch over to a presentation by Shiji Xu, investigating the global impact of carbon-based logging in FATES. And so while Shiji is getting set up, please remember you can always enter questions for the presenters in the chat. Thank you, Montasir. And Shiji, we can see your screen. Can you test your audio?
Hello.
I can hear you, Shiji.
Yeah. So let's start.
Yes. Yes.
Hi. I'm Shiji Xu. Currently a postdoc working in Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Today, my topic will be the global impact of carbon-based logging, which we recently implemented into FATES models. And I'd like to first thank my collaborator, Jennifer Holm, my supervisor, and also the whole FATES team, without which's help could not make this work happen. And also, I would like to thank the sponsor from the Department of Energy and E3SM project. So, why are we going to implement the biomass C-based FATES logging? The first, most important thing is the biomass carbon-based harvest rate data is more accurate comparing to the area-based harvest rate data set, which right now most model is using area-based. But within the FATES models, the good thing is in the FATES we have the fully implemented the growth of the secondary forest from the beginning. So in order to maximize this functionalities, we started to think about incorporating the biomass-based C-based loggings into the FATES model. The basic ideas as this workflow is showing, first we're reading, comparing to the harvest rate in area fraction, we're reading the harvest rate in carbon biomass, and then we assume the biomass is equally distributed in each cohort, and then calculate the fraction of the area based on the fraction of the harvest rate to the total forest carbon which is available to be harvested in the FATES. And then after we calculated this fraction, we then transfer into the already existing subroutines to calculate the harvest rate, harvested carbon mass, and the new area of the primary forest becoming the secondary forest patches. And after we got this implementation down, we have set up two tests. The first is the Brazil site case, which is 1x1_Brazil case in the CSM or E3SM model. And the spin up is from 0 for 200 years. And the transition case, we start from year 1950 directly to test the code and see if the harvest C and the area in the primary forest land matches what the LH2 data set showing. And for this site, we don't have any secondary forest harvest, so we can skip checking that. And the second case we have done is a global 4x5 degree simulations with the LH2 data set forest harvest rate as the driving data set. And the non-forest harvest rate currently is excluded because we still haven't think about the grass harvest for the grass and shrub being implemented very detailed into the FATES model. So for this global cases, the spin up will be from the 0 for 150 years under a new function called fixed biogeography setting, which each grid cells can only allow those PFTs described in the biogeographic map. So this can constrain very weird, like tropical forests residing into a temperate region happen. So, and this has been introduced by Jackie and Will earlier. So for this spin up, because from the simulation 1890s, we already have the secondary forest exist. But when we spin up, we don't generate enough secondary forest. So we separate the spin up phases, transient cases into two phases. For the phase one, we start from 1850 to 1890 for 40 years to just introduce certain area to be secondary forest based on the harvest rate described by the LH2. And our official simulations for the transient cases will start from 1890 to check the harvested carbon area for both primary and secondary forests. And the first is a Brazil site case. It's actually 2 by 2 degree. And to the left is showing the validated harvested carbon comparison for phase and ALH2. This will check the consistency between the data set and the actual carbon calculated in phase. And to the right, well, more importantly is we want to check once we're reading this carbon amount, how this land area of the secondary forest looks like when comparing the phase to the ALUC time series. As you can see here, the calculated secondary forest fraction is actually a little bit less comparing to the harvest area fraction by H2. This is mostly due to a higher biomass in the current site compared to the biomass data set used by LH2. And a quick validation of the site level. Let's see how the global case is working. For the left is showing the secondary forest area in the unit of fraction of each grid area in the year 2009. And to the right is primary forest harvested carbon. As you can see, for growth of the secondary forest, most of places are having consistent area when you compare LH2 to the fates, except for in the northern region, the fates seems to have more area transferring into the secondary forest, mostly due to there will be less vegetation carbon available for harvest in that region growing there. And to the right, we have the primary forest harvested carbon, and most of the regions, they're comparable to each other. And the only places having a little bit trouble is also the same places where we have the more area transfer into secondary forest, and you have less carbons being harvested also in there. And this is showing the curve of the to the left of the global harvested carbon, and to the right is the harvested area of the comparison between the FATES model simulated and LH2 data set showing. So to the left, we can see the FATES estimation is almost can cover what primary forest described by LH2 data set. But for the secondary forest harvested patches, we can see the FATES only can capture part of that, and we will show later in the global map where we don't have enough carbon to be harvested. And to the right, we're more concerning about when we transfer to the harvested area, what the carbon biomass base look like. And we can see there are large differences between the secondary forest increment described as the green color line, showing calculated by FATES comparing to the harvested primary forest area described by the ALH2 data set. But when we have another standard, we think about only with the harvested biomass density very large, means where those regions have more carbon being harvested, we have a threshold 0.02 kilogram carbon per meter square per year. Then we will see those areas with most of the carbon being harvested have a very equivalent area, which is showing that the large difference is actually mostly caused by those regions with relatively sparse vegetation carbon. And here is showing a harvest depth between the primary and the secondary forests. The harvest depth can be explained as the carbon amount not harvested successfully due to less biomass than the harvest rate described by the dataset. To the left is showing the primary patches, and to the right is showing secondary. As we can see, most of the regions have certain kind of shortages of the carbon available. And we also have several standards discussing the causes of these kind of shortages. So the first kind of the issue from the FATES is you don't have secondary forest that reach maturity. The second one is described by reason one is we don't have any cohorts survived for those gracils. And reason number two, we have low growth rate, which means the change of the secondary biomass is lower than the harvest rate as we calculated. And third reason is we have very tiny area of the secondary forest, which we define as less than 1% of the gracil. And here, certain sites we extracted from the global map. The first site is places near Sahara Desert, which we don't have any cohorts survive. This is showing the curve of the spin up. As you can see, there's certain time we have this C4 grasses and also evergreen, needle leaf evergreens existed for certain period, but as spin up going on, it disappeared finally. So we need to think about how we can maintain certain amount of cohort for those kind of area. And the second one is the low growth rate, which we extracted from one site close to Siberia regions. And we can see these vegetation carbon is actually stabilized at a relatively lower value, which only have 0.8 kilogram carbon. Comparing to the harvest rate around 0.2, this can only happen in 5 years, and the area, the whole forest area will be cleared. And we'll think about how to increase that biomass in certain region.
CG, you're at 10 minutes.
Oh, sorry. So finally, we maintain have these kind of challenges through this work. Right now, we have mismatch of the primary forest distribution, and also secondary forest is substantial even from the beginning. We need to think about initialization, and we have to think about different traits being applied when we regrow these secondary forests. Thank you.
That was great, Shiji. Thank you. And I want to express our excitement that we're applying land cover land use change globally. So nice work. We have Shiji, if you could stop sharing your screen, yeah, and sure. Then while Changgang is sharing his screen, if there is a question for Shiji, you can go ahead and ask it now, or you can place that in the chat. And so, is Changgang here? Oh, okay. Well, it looks like we might be missing our next presenter, unless he's on as an unnamed. Okay, we were expecting a presentation by Changgang Zhu, but I do not see him. And I don't know how quickly we would be able to get him to jump online. Oh, that's too bad.
Can I ask a question of CG?
Please.
Are you still there?
No, sure.
CG? Oh, cool. I'm curious, I haven't really thought about this, but in seeing your presentation, it strikes me that like trying to, I'm struck by the challenges of doing land use change. I guess that's maybe the high level comment. And I'm curious in the kind of parameter calibration space, like you have to have the right biomass to get the right carbon, to get the right amount of secondary forest in a grid cell, which just makes it really tricky to understand how to do the parameter calibration. And I'm curious where land use change falls in that calibration cascade. Is that something that happens? Does land use change happen after? Does it come in like after you do the kind of allocation parameterization that comes in with fixed biogeography, or do those two things happen together? Because you kind of have to get, yeah, I don't even know how to ask the question, other than I'm struck by the complexity of the problem in watching your presentation.
I see. I didn't do any calibration yet for those regions.
Right.
Actually didn't show the total vegetation carbon right now. It's estimated on global scale. It's a little bit high to me.
Which makes sense if you're not getting enough secondary forest because you have
yeah.
primary, you're able to harvest the primary.
Yeah, there has certain region which you have too high biomass, but the harvest rate relatively low. So you can only have very tiny area to become secondary forest patches. And a certain small area of the secondary forest patches, later in those regions, you will have higher secondary forest harvest rate, and then you cannot fulfill that. This is one very big question I have found right now in this.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
We really think about how to first you get certain amount of initialization of the vegetation carbon to become more reasonable. That will be very important when we trigger at the beginning how your secondary forest area can expand. That will be very important when we do the area based biomass based instead of area based.
I saw that Adrianna had her hand raised, and Rosie has a question in the chat. And I know that Jackie
Changgang here.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I don't want to take up Chunggang's time if he's ready to go. But
well, no, he's attempting to join. I don't. So we can.
I was just going to respond to your question. Well, I think you were asking about the FATES calibration cascade and like when we would bring in land use land cover change. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, just like how land use land cover change slots in.
I mean, I think maybe Rosie also has an opinion, but I would think, the after no comp and PSP mode are kind of designed to get at the PFT sort of like controlled growth, get that going well. And then fixed biogeography is kind of when we bring in all these other dynamics. We didn't talk about disturbance, but obviously disturbances like fire and land, logging are really important. So I think that's probably going to be an iterative process where we bring in these mortality impacts. But theoretically, if we can get growth and allocation correctly, cutting down a forest will then, as long as we get that method correct, the regrowth will be accurate. But that's sort of the theory.
Yeah, and then Rosie had a question as well. What did you mean by maturity in the category of cells that didn't reach maturity?
In actually it said you have two different harvest rate for the secondary forest. Secondary forest, young forest, and secondary mature forest. And right now in the FATES, we have our definition for this maturity, which right now the parameter by default setting to 90 years. So the patches survive, secondary forest patches survive for 90 years, they will be mature secondary forest. Before that will be young secondary forest. And right now for my simulation, I set that to 40 years. Basically, you can have some more reasonable settings, like to say once the change of the biomass every year less than certain threshold, you think that reach maturity. This sounds to me more reasonable, but right now this setting by year just right now.
Shiji, thanks for fielding extra questions.
Yeah, no problem.
So I contacted Chunggang and he is trying to join. We do have a break scheduled for 10:05, so we will not skip our break. But we've done development on the fire side, and so I was optimistic to let you all hear about this. But I'm not sure how long we'll wait. So
maybe we should take a break now, and if Chunggang is ready early, or we can just have our break starting a little bit earlier and then come back a few minutes earlier potentially.
I don't know that I want to switch from the schedule, because if we have people joining remotely, I don't want us to get off sync. And so but so if anybody has a general question for any of the presenters, we can certainly field that in this last 5 minutes. It looks unlikely that Chunggang will be able to. I don't know what's happening. So, but Jennifer had a comment in the chat. Sorry, Will?
Oh, I was going to say, hopefully Chunggang could come present either at a FATES meeting or a CLM meeting.
Yeah, we can invite Chungyang to present another time. And I was trying to find a slide with his major result, but I yeah, not able to find that immediately. Jennifer, did you want to share your comment, or Peter Lawrence?
I was just going to say that because LUH2 actually prescribes both the carbon amounts, this is for Shiji, is just that you could actually actively use both. You don't need to use just one or the other. It's like you could combine the two together to work out the carbon extraction densities and ensure that you get the secondary forest area as LUH2 would have expected. And would that address some of the issues he's finding?
Oh yeah, yeah. I thought about like when you initialize, you use the because I know H2 has the second floor fraction, so you can superimpose that data set in there, first add the area, and then use the carbon amount as the harvest rate to drive the model. Yeah, you certainly can get those being constant to each other. But when you superimpose the area, I guess you don't simulate the dynamic process when you grow from 0 to the grown forest when you simulate the secondary patches.
Right.
So this kind of skip those functionalities in the fates.
I guess,
have the
sorry.
Yeah.
I guess we did discuss this. I mean, it's not always clear cut when we're doing forest application as well. So fates might be like representing always clear cut forestry, whereas there might actually be like, selective forestry happening. And those might set up your secondary forests in a very different way. That was all I was going to get at.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we have, I think we'll say a final question from Will Shiji, and I think it's really relevant to the work that you've just been doing. Stepping back from this presentation, does the harvested biomass go to the hostland model product pools?
Yeah, right now, yes, it has. But I have some output for the net system exchange also, but I'm not sure. Some places maybe not correct. They give me very huge amount of emission right now. So I'll double check what actually happened there. We have this. We're right now using the bookkeeping model in the HRM. Right now I'm working on E3SM, but I think it's the same in CLM also.
Okay.
So we'll check later how this direct and indirect land use emissions and breaking to components, see what have been changed actually.
Yeah, it's an important part of, that needs further testing. But the work that you've done demonstrating it globally is an important step forward for FATES. I'm going to pass it back to Will, and then we will try to check in with Chungyang to hear about live fuel moisture. So Will, take it away. Thank you for a great first session, everyone, and thank you for the good questions.
That's awesome. Yeah, so we've got just a 5-minute kind of bio break scheduled, but if you need more time, please take it. Kind of some of the feedback that we often get in these meetings is that we more kind of informal time to chat would be nice to have. And so we've scheduled 20 minutes in here to have virtual coffee break rooms. So, go stretch your legs, have a little break, come back with some tea or coffee if you'd like. And then when you do come back from the break, you can just jump into a breakout room. Hopefully everyone will be able to move themselves there and just, stop in and chat with people. So if you see someone you want to talk to, grab a breakout room and go chat there. And hopefully, Roberta, folks are able to do that on their own and kind of move about freely. So, but then we'll come back at 10:30 Mountain Time for Polly's presentation. So take a quick 5-minute break here, and then come back and drop in on a coffee chat if you'd like with somebody. Great. See everyone in a few minutes. Roberta, should I leave this up just so when people come back from their break, they know what's going on?
Yeah, except we're not seeing the full screen. So
Oh, you're not?
mm-mm,
What are you seeing?
lots of things.
Oh, really? That's weird.
It's your like presentation notes mode.
Oh, you're seeing
Just click
that.
swap displays. Yeah. There you go.
Good.
Is that better?
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
And do you see all the Zoom rooms open?
I don't.
I do.
Okay, I was gonna say it's when I'm sharing screens. That's why I was trying to stop sharing my screen, is because it looks, at least on my end, it looks funny.
So,
Oh, there. Now I can see a choose breakout room.
So everyone can choose their own room.
So presumably if I jump into a room, then you're going to lose the screen share here.
Well, I can share the slide too if you do that, if that happens. I have that slide.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll try jumping in a breakout room and see if we lose it. All right. It looks like that'll stop my screen sharing.
Okay, don't worry. I'll share my screen.
Okay, great. Thanks. Roberta, thanks for being the taskmaster.
It's my job.
I appreciate it. There's so many people here. Oh, good. Polly's here. Is Danica back?
I'm here, so I can
You're here.
always
Okay.
help.
Great.
Sorry.
Perfect. Thanks, Jackie. And Jackie, you were planning on timing for this round?
Yes, and so I will keep time, and then Danica was going to moderate.
Okay, that sounds great. Polly, do you want to go ahead and share your screen? And then I think all the breakout rooms are closed by now. You can probably go ahead and get started. Great.
Okay, thanks.
Take it away, Polly. Thanks.
So I'd like to share some work that we're doing in California, trying to understand the drivers of the observed 20th century shifts in the mixed conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada. And I'd like to start acknowledging that this is work that Laura and Charlie and John Battles, whom probably many of you don't know, are doing. And these pictures here are showing what has happened in the forest. It went from pre-colonization times from a pine-dominated, low-density surface fire regime type of forest, and there's been a lot of infilling. Density has increased, and a lot of that increased density has come from shade-tolerant species. So our question is, which global change and forest management drivers have contributed the most to these increases in tree density and shade-tolerant composition over the 20th century? And we're looking at warming, increasing CO2 concentration, fire suppression, and harvest. And I'd like to say that this work is not possible without the funding from the UC Office of the President, from the gracious allocation on Cheyenne, from Dave and Will, and from our Corey allocation from the DOE Directors Fund. So thank you all very much. And I'd also like to say that the reason why we're doing this we didn't start out to do an attribution study. We want to use FATES. So we're using CLM-FATES, and we want to use it to project what are the implications of management that might happen today for future forest change and fire severity and fire intensity. But to do that, we really have to believe that the model can actually represent this forest well. And so there's really two prerequisites. So the attribution study is like a step on the way to doing that. And the prerequisites for the attribution study are, we have to be able to accurately simulate the pre-colonization forest structure and composition and the fire regime. Then we also have to be able to accurately simulate these changes that have been observed, the increased forest density and changes in species composition. So again, we're working just in the mixed conifer forest of the Sierra Nevada, and PFTs are defined to represent three fairly different ecological strategies. And they differentiate in terms of shade tolerance, drought tolerance, and fire resistance. We have a sort of general pine type that is the least shade tolerant, but the most fire resistant. We have a white fir basically type that is very shade tolerant, but not at all fire resistant. And then incense cedar, which is the most drought tolerant, sort of in between in fire resistance and more shade tolerant. So cedar and fir are the shade tolerant, pine is the fire resistant species. And I'm not going to talk about how we did the parameterization, just to say that it's when working in this sort of smaller domain with one forest type, is able to actually do all of the tuning at once instead of needing to go through the different complexity modes that Adrianna was talking about. The strategies we used would be much more challenging at a global scale, but here they worked. So for the pre-colonization simulations, did spin up with early 1900s climate, holding CO2 constant at 285 parts per million, then checking for equilibrium conditions, which I'm also not going to talk about today. And the at the site level, where we started doing the parameterization, we had a low elevation and a high elevation site so that we could capture the more pine dominated low elevation and the more fir dominated higher elevation. And that we ended up with 9 parameterizations that met a bunch of filters on do they meet our ecological expectations. And from there, we went to regional simulations with those 9 parameterizations to benchmark those regional simulations with this forest structure, composition, and fire regime, and then some sanity checks. Do the species climate relationships look like we expect they would? And those I'm also not going to talk about today. So this regional benchmarking, it really served as another filter to narrow down those 9 potential parameterizations. And so here we're looking at histograms. This is the last year of the simulation across the domains. So spatially, the distributions represent the range of spatial variability: percent pine, percent cedar, percent fir. Quadratic mean diameter is a measure of forest structure, and then the fire return interval. And the vertical red lines are the expected range based on what we could find for forest conditions from tree ring reconstruction analyses and some really early 1900s surveys that had actually measured these things. And so we ended up that there were 3 parameterizations of those 9 that had at least 80% of the range, spatial range within the expected range, and they had reasonable species climate relationships. So from there, we were able to go to the 20th century simulations to do the attribution. So here we use prescribed ignitions, spatially explicit prescribed ignitions to replicate the observed area burned, created a harvest time series, an area-based harvest based on harvest records, and running with transient climate and CO2, then benchmarking the regional simulation against observed changes in species composition and density, and some sanity checks on water use efficiency to kind of gauge, is the CO2 response reasonable? So I only have one parameter, one of the 3 to show today, but it's almost 80%. This is 79% in one category, but across these categories of composition and density, was able to achieve these, replicate these changes in the 19th or 20th century simulations. So then for the attribution, we held 1 driver constant at a time and then differenced from this baseline simulation that had the prescribed fire, harvest, and transient. So some results. This top figure is showing over time the change, the difference from the baseline in percent units of percent. And this is percent, the change in percent pine averaged over the spatial domain for each year. And the bottom is showing what is this, the average of this time series, just to more easily see which drivers are the most important. And pretty obviously, fire is having the largest effect on the change in pine composition, and it's decreasing. There's less pine when we take out, there's less pine when fire is being suppressed, as it was in the 20th century, which is, you know, good. That's what we would expect and what the benchmarking showed. So then the next is showing cedar in the middle and fir on the right. Again, fire is the most important, but fire suppression is the most important, but it's increasing the shade tolerant species. Then if we look at density, again, fire is the most important driver, and pine is decreasing, cedar and fir are increasing. And there's a lot of interesting detail to get into here that I frankly haven't even done the analyses on. These results are fairly fresh. And ultimately, what we'll be doing is putting, range around each of these lines. We'll have 3 parameterizations to say, what's the variability in these changes due to parameterization? That's one of the primary goals. And so right now, with one parameterization, it can say fire really had clearly the largest influence. So that indicates that these forests really are fire starved. They have a fire debt, and we need more fire, but that's really tricky because there are interactions between continued warming and fuel loads and fire behavior, and that makes this a really tricky problem to solve. But we will be able to use FATES then to move forward. And, I think the other goal is, can we believe the model? And I think, yes, we can believe the model. So thanks again to our funders and our allocation supporters. And thanks a lot for listening.
Perfect timing, Polly.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Polly. If you stopped sharing. And so if there are questions, if people want to ask them, I see that there's already one in the chat. Do you have some hypothesis about why CO2 has a negative effect on pine? And Jessica, if you want to start screen sharing while Polly's answering that question, that would be.
I haven't had much time to look at this yet, but I think it's a competitive. I don't think it's that CO2 itself is hurting pine. I think that it's the competitive dynamics with cedar and fir that are decreasing pine's competitive ability. But that's a very quick early answer because I really haven't had much time to dig into it yet.
Great. I think we have time for another question that says, I'm curious whether snowmelt has large impacts on the forest change in the mountainous regions.
Yeah, so am I. Again, I don't know. And but there's another student whose name, Jackie or Laura, if you can help me with, who is really starting to dig into the snow dynamics in some of these simulations as well. So again, I don't know, but it does in real life. So hopefully it's playing out in the model as well.
Great, thank you. And Laura says it's Marianne Cowherd.
Yes.
So yeah. So our next speaker is Jessica Needham. Jessica, it looks like you're unmuted, so go ahead, you have 10 minutes.
Great, thanks, Danica. So hi everyone, I'm going to be talking today about a project implementing a crown damage module into FATES. And this was work carried out with a bunch of co-authors who are listed here from the FATES development team and also from Forest Geo, who supplied a lot of the data that was used in benchmarking. So the rationale for this work was that crown damage is a really important process in tropical forests. It's a really strong predictor of mortality, and it has a big impact on the carbon cycling. So this is a figure from a paper from 3 years ago showing structural equation modeling that found that crown form was a really important predictor of mortality. And then this paper used data from across 6 tropical forests and found that crown loss, this second row here, was both very prevalent and also had the second largest impact on mortality after light limitation in these forests. So in FATES, we implement crown damage as a reduction in cohorts crown area and also their crown biomass. So that's shown in panel A here. We have these canopy trees shown in light green. They have this reduction in their crown area and biomass. And as a result, these understory trees shown in the dark green here get promoted into the canopy. And we basically split up cohorts. So if we have a healthy cohort here with a complete crown, we divide it up into these new cohorts, which have varying degrees of crown loss. So here, 20, 40, 60, and 80% reduction in their crowns. And in this initial implementation of FATES, we were trying to answer these 2 main questions. So do lags between environmental drivers and mortality matter for forest dynamics? And how does the introduction of damage change simulated growth and mortality rates? So starting with this first question, we know that trees can survive for many years or even decades with really quite severe crown loss. And these altered allometries could change canopy structure, light levels through the canopy, competitive dynamics. So that's what we were trying to trying to address with this first question. So we tested this with 4 configurations of FATES. We have a control simulation, a damage-only simulation in which cohorts have a reduction in their crowns, a damage and mortality simulation in which there's a reduction in crowns, and also an additional mortality term where mortality increases as crown damage increases. And finally, we have a mortality-only simulation. And in this version, there is no reduction in the crowns of any cohort, but they do have additional mortality. And this configuration was really to test whether we need a representation of crown loss itself, or whether most of the changes in dynamics we see would be just due to an increase in mortality. So this is showing the major results from those 4 configurations of FATES. And you can see that the biggest decreases in above ground biomass were in these configurations that had additional mortality. And the blue dot here is an estimate of biomass at Barro Colorado Island in Panama. We do also see, though, that there's a reduction in biomass in the damage-only simulations. And similar for canopy height threshold. So this is the minimum size that a cohort would need to be in the canopy. And again, the largest decreases come from these simulations that have additional mortality. But we do see a big decrease in the damage-only simulation compared to the control. So we then looked at competitive dynamics. So in this simulation, we have 2 PFTs. They're identical, except that following damage, the first PFT will allocate all of its available carbon to regrowing its crown, so getting back onto regular allometries. And the second PFT will allocate all available carbon to DBH growth. So it will continue to grow its diameter, but it will not regrow the crown. So it will stay with this reduction in its crown area and crown biomass. And what we find is that the PFT that allocates carbon to regrowing the crown will outcompete this PFT that allocates carbon to DBH growth. Okay, so how does damage change demographic rates? So we suspected that this would be quite sensitive to carbon metabolism. Damage is basically reducing the photosynthetic capacity of a tree whilst leaving respiration of the stem and the below ground tissues intact. And so you can imagine that at some point, as if the crown is reduced so much that photosynthesis can't meet respiratory demand, then we might start to see increases in mortality from carbon starvation. So we tested this by altering root nitrogen stoichiometry parameters. So this, as you increase root nitrogen stoichiometry, you increase root respiration, and that leads to a reduction in the ratio of leaf respiration to stem and root respiration. And what we find is that there's this threshold at which, as a certain value of root nitrogen stoichiometry, carbon starvation mortality really sharply increases. But we only see this in the cohorts that had 80% crown loss. So this is kind of suggesting that at a certain threshold, root respiration becomes so high that the photosynthesis in the crown cannot meet that respiratory demand. And so we get this carbon starvation mortality. We also find that damage leads to a reduction in growth rates. So this is crown loss against diameter growth per year. The green here are observations from Barro Colorado Island. And then we have the low root respiration configuration of FATES and the high root respiration configuration. And as expected, the high root respiration configuration of FATES has much lower growth rates, but both configurations do capture that reduction in growth with increasing crown loss that we see in the data. Okay, so this is really the first kind of exploration of this new functionality. I think there's a lot more that we can still do with this. And one thing I'm interested in is how disturbances that overlap in space and time could change final mortality rates. So we can imagine that a tree that is damaged in one disturbance event might be more susceptible to mortality in following disturbances. And we don't really capture that at the moment. But if we had this damage module on and we have this legacy of disturbance, then we might actually get altered mortality rates as a result of trees sort of being more susceptible to future disturbance. And then finally, this work was all benchmarked against data from Barrow, Colorado Island, which doesn't really have any major disturbances. So I think looking at dynamics in places where there are more severe disturbance could be very interesting. And this is something that Mingji Shi is looking at using data from Puerto Rico and the effect of crown damage on hurricane disturbance and recovery. So I'll just conclude here. So the damage module is providing us with these new capabilities for testing hypotheses related to disturbance and forest recovery. The effect of damage on stand structure was mostly due to altered mortality, but we do find that damage itself decreased above ground biomass and also altered the canopy height structure. PFTs that allocate to regrowing their crown were able to outcompete PFTs that allocated carbon to their diameter growth. Damage caused decreases in growth rates and increases in carbon starvation mortality, but these results were very sensitive to carbon metabolism. And future work will really delve into how damage influences post-hurricane forest recovery. And with that, I'll just thank funders for their support. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. We have a few minutes for questions. Maybe you want to stop sharing your screen so that Pierre can start sharing his screen. So if anybody has questions, feel free to, it looks like Jackie has raised her hand, so I'll let her ask her question.
That was really nice, Jessie. And maybe I missed this. How long does it take? And so I understand that when trees are damaged, they have the ability to recover. Did you look at approximately how long it takes them to recover?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an exact number for you. I think it was kind of happening on the order of sort of a decade or maybe several decades. It wasn't sort of instantaneous. They needed to kind of accumulate carbon that they could then allocate to leaves and branches.
Yeah, that's great. It'll be really nice to see how this comes together with legacy impacts of disturbance.
Yeah, Will, you have a question?
Jesse, this is more, I guess, a stepping back FATES question, is why would plants and FATES ever add more nitrogen to their roots? Because at least my understanding is it wouldn't actually do anything, or does it do, like, does having more nitrogen in your roots do something for plants and FATES?
That is a good question. I'm not actually sure what the benefit of that, having that increase in root nitrogen would be. I was kind of more interested in just, we have that parameter value and how sensitive were these results and increases in carbon starvation to that parameter. When I initially ran the model with the default parameterization, we didn't see any carbon starvation mortality, which was a little unexpected. So we were kind of thinking about how, like, we know that trees do sometimes die of carbon starvation mortality. So kind of why were we not seeing that in FATES, and what were the kind of parameters controlling that?
Thanks.
Great, thanks. It looks like there's also a question from Laura in the chat that says, sorry if I missed this, but can trees shed roots?
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. So in this implementation, we left kind of the below ground allometries intact, but I think that actually the data does suggest that if a tree has some crown damage, it would actually reduce allocation to roots, and there would be kind of, we probably wouldn't actually see maybe the carbon starvation that we saw in the model if we'd had that reduction in root biomass following crown loss. So that's something I'm looking into and trying to find good data on that. So yeah, I should look at the data from Puerto Rico, and I think that's a good next step.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to announce that Changyang will be presenting his talk at the end of this session. So just keep that in mind for everybody at that. And after Brett Rexa, we'll have Changyang presenting. Next up is Pierre Gentin. So Pierre, if you want to, I think it looks like you're unmuted.
Yeah, great, thanks. Is it full screen just to check?
Yes, it is.
Great, okay, perfect. So it's mostly presenting the work of a postdoc in my group. His name is Julian, and he's been working on Canopy Interception, and that's been supported by Schmidt Future and also by our recent NSF and Science and Technology Center called LEAP, which is at the interface between artificial intelligence and physics. So kind of the motivation behind this work is trying to think about Canopy Interception, which is really kind of the first step when we think about precipitation and rainfall and kind of shading what is going to happen into the soil. And that's going to impact runoff. If there's more interception, you're going to reduce runoff, but also soil moisture as well. So that could have also some impact in terms of vegetation growth in the long run. And we know that, or we have actually relatively few constraints in terms of partitioning of evapotranspiration, and especially how much is actually allocated to kind of interception. There's quite a bit of work on leaf transpiration through SAP measurement and SAP flow, in particular with the recent SAP FluxNet. And soil evaporation, there's been quite a bit of instrumentation of like bare ground data. So, but kind of interception remains relatively unconstrained at this stage, especially at the global scale. So we wanted to kind of revisit that and trying to think what could actually happen at the global scale. And another motivation is that a lot of the kind of interception models are actually relatively empirical, and a lot of them are actually based on this GASH model from back in the 90s, and really strongly depend on leaf area index and the total leaf and stem area that's going to be covered by vegetation, and also on some parameter, which is the storage capacity. So how much you can think of that, what is the bucket size that we have per unit leaf area, and how much we can actually basically store as a function of time and during rainfall events. So the motivation was trying to revisit that and trying to see what is really the baseline that we could get and what are the physical mechanisms behind canopy interception, and has it been changing over the last couple of decades in particular. The issue that we are facing is that we don't have, or we have very, very few measurements of canopy interception, and they tend to be very sparse just within one particular tree. And again, we want to work at the ecosystem scale. So ideally trying to leverage a lot of the FluxNet towers or all of those elecovariance towers across the globe. And so what we thought is one strategy one could have would be to think, maybe what if we could actually fit, let's say, a model or a statistical model away from a precipitation event, and then another one during precipitation event. And then if we were to take the difference in between, then that could actually encapsulate basically canopy interception. That could also account for fast soil re-evaporation, but overall, that's what we would call canopy interception. And so the design we had, we took a rainy period, across all of the FluxNet sites. So we did that over each particular site and at an hourly time scale. And we really defined two models, one that was away from the precipitation event, so further than 12 hours back in time. And then we expanded that model back into the period when we had rain. And then we looked at the difference between the model with rain and without rain. And that was our best estimate of canopy interception. Now, one trick is that if you use a statistical model, the issue that we will quickly face is that we will be in some sort of extrapolation phase. So that wouldn't work very well. And so that's why we actually leveraged this work by a current actually postdoc, Wenyi Zhao, who's been working on this so-called hybrid machine learning model, where we try to blend physics and machine learning. And we showed in that previous work that it actually does a very good job at extrapolating, because it embeds a lot of the physics in there. So that's based on some sort of the diffusion and Pelman-Monteith version. And so we could actually fit a model during the rainy period and the non-rainy period, and then again, taking the difference. So, and then just in terms of the driver of this model, we have temperature, wind speed, vapor pressure deficit, radiation, plant functional type, and leaf area index. And PFT, because we thought that could actually impact the hydrophilic dependence of the canopy interception. And then again, one of the model only has precipitation, the other one doesn't see precipitation. And the difference between the two is the estimate of canopy interception. We use FluxNet sites across the globe, so spanning different climates, different plant functional type. We aggregate everything to the hourly time scale. We removed everything that was below 0 degrees Celsius because we didn't want to cover snowfall, because we know that's going to be a lot more time dependent. So that's something we wanted to avoid. And then we use the leaf area index for MODIS as a driver as well. And when we look at the training and test set for those two different models, with rain and without rain, so at the top you have the rainless, so without rain experiment, and at the bottom you have the case with rain. They tend to do a very good job on the training data, but also on the test data, so excluding points where we had trained the model. So we believe this kind of build confidence into the quality of the model, and we tried also in periods when we really away from the precipitation event, and that works really well as well. So there was not a very strong autocorrelation just built into the model. A sanity check that we had was to check that, and we did that more systematically across sites, but to check that indeed when you have the model that's trained with rain, you're actually getting more mass, right? More water, more evaporation. And that's basically what is shown here. So the dark blue here is the model with rain, and the other one is without rain. And you can see that there's a systematic bias in between, which is what we expect, right? There should be some kind of interception. And if you have, for instance, rain at night, it's not happening right away, but it also depends on radiation, right? So there's this memory process. So I don't have time to get into that, but we are actually accounting for memory as a water storage component. And indeed, we can see that when there's rain, actually, there's this increase in evapotranspiration, which is this canopy interception that we are picking up, even when we have rain at night, and then later in the day when radiation is available, that's really when canopy interception will actually occur. And then we started investigating the drivers of that. So thinking about precipitation during the rain event. So that seems to be the key driver of that. We looked at leaf area index and wind speed. And what we found is that leaf area index is not such a big driver, such as in the typical models that people use. And we thought, and we looked more into that, and that seems to be more of a confounder. So of course, there's some leaf area index dependence, but the primary mechanism is really the intensity of rain. So the more intense the rain, the better it is at penetrating into the canopy, and the lighter the rain, the more canopy re-evaporation will be. And then we could come up with global estimates of that, and we compare that to other estimates. And of course, you would expect, I mean, there's indeed some at higher leaf area index and higher precipitation dependence. We are actually seeing that increase in canopy interception. That's what you would expect. But it's actually instructive to look at the ratio between canopy interception and precipitation. And there we can see that it's not just LAI, it's actually very dependent on the intensity of rain. So in savanna regions, for instance, you're actually seeing very intense rainfall. And that's where you will get a lot more interception. So quick take-home message. So rainfall characteristics are very important for canopy interception. We can derive a global mean upscaling of the ratio of canopy interception to mean precipitation, and it's roughly 9%. And that can be used as a constraint across climates and plant functional types for CLM. And I haven't had the time to show that, but we also looked at the trend in canopy interception, and we could show that there's been quite a bit of decrease because rain events are less frequent and more intense, and that's been reported for quite some time, since 2000, and that drives a global decline in canopy interception and the ratio over precipitation. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Pierre. We do have a little bit of time for questions if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. I see that there's one in the chat from John Burns. Pierre, how do you differentiate between ground evaporation and evaporation of intercepted rain?
Yeah, we can. So that's a good comment. So we don't have a mechanism by which we can actually differentiate between the two. Yeah, because we just have disaggregate. So we call that fast re-evaporation, but you're right. I mean, there could be some soil component as well.
Okay, thank you. Gordon, you have a question.
Pierre, that was really great, and it's really fun to sort of see how you're bringing these ideas of like machine learning to inform parameterizations. Is this something that would directly go into a land surface model like CLM, or because you were actually talking about it sort of physically based, and you would actually it's consistent with the Penman-Monteith equation, or would you just use this to sort of help guide and tune CLM?
I would, that's a great question. I would see that in two steps to be pragmatic. I would say first, let's use that as a tuning, and that would using the existing parameters. So that would be one way to actually partition things potentially better. And then the second step is, because I didn't talk about that, but we are basically resolving the water storage capacity of the canopy. So that's something we could actually embed in the model as well. And that's something we could actually resolve. And that seems relatively simple. So yeah, that would be the ultimate plan, I would say. But we're trying to dig a little bit more into the physics as to why. I mean, I didn't talk about that much, but wind is also very important because that can shake the canopy. And we can see that. I had actually some experiments with accelerometers as well, where you can see the shaking and we can see that it's also decreasing the evaporation. So there's more penetration through the canopy. So there's some fun, like very nonlinear feedbacks in there. Thanks.
Okay, it looks like there's one more question in the chat here if you want to take a look at that, but I think that we need to
sure. Sounds good, yeah.
Senlin He will be talking next. Thanks,
can you see my screen?
Yes, yeah, we can see your screen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk about our ongoing work regarding some of the new features and enhancements added to the CTSM or CRM, if you will, SNICA snow albedo scheme. So the SNICA is the name for the snow albedo radiation transfer scheme within the CRM or CTSM. So this is really a collaborative work under support of the NOAA CPT project. So as we know that the snow albedo and the snowpack is very important in terms of it can regulate the land surface energy and water balance, especially when there is some perturbation in the snowpack and albedo. It will trigger the positive feedback, as you can see here, to either cooling or warming the land surface. So here I'm briefly introduce the major model physics included in the current climate models, including the CESM, CTSM system. So first, we have these snow physics, physical properties, which can be used to interact with the solar radiation. And then we will have these snow radiative properties computed. And finally, we can calculate the snowpack albedo through the radiation transfer scheme. And specifically for the snow physical properties, we are considering the grain size, shape, and refract index. And then through the particle optics computations, we can get this extinction, single scattering albedo, and asymmetry factor for the snow radiative properties or optical properties. And if we also have the snowpack properties like density, thickness, layer structures, then all these can be input to the snow radiation transfer scheme to get the snowpack albedo. Once we have the pure snow albedo, then one thing that can complicate the picture is the light absorbing aerosols like dust, soot, or black carbon, as well as some of the light absorbing organic carbon. When they deposit onto the snowpack, they can reduce the snow albedo by modifying this mixture, snow aerosol mixture optical properties through these different radiative refractive index, size distribution, concentration, and the mixing states. So once we have this perturbed snowpack albedo, this can feedback to the entire climate system through the surface temperature, snowfall, wind, and relative humidity. On the one way that this environment change can further affect the snow physical properties through the fresh snowfall and snow aging processes. And then the snow aging and melting processes perturbed by the environmental forcing can also affect the snowpack properties and structures, which further affects the snow albedo. And lastly, this environment change can also affect the aerosol processes like transport, deposition, removal in the snowpack, and further affect the aerosol snow radiation interactions. So inside the CRM CTSM SNICA system, this is what we currently do for the snowpack albedo calculations. We have the ME calculations through the lookup tables to read in the snow optical properties and also the aerosol optical properties. Remember here, the CRM assumes the sphere snow shape. And then for this online SNICA coupled with the CRM CTSM, we also have the snow aging process to alter the snow grain size, which further affects these snow optical properties. And if we have these snow optical and optics and the aerosol optics, then by assuming the aerosol snow mixing state, then we can calculate the mixture optical properties. So by default, CRM assumes the external mixing, which means we just linearly add all these snow and aerosol optical properties. And finally, we can calculate the snow albedo through the two-stream radiative transfer. So in the next few slides, I'm going to update all these different major components listed here in the CRM CTSM SNICA based on the latest updated standalone version of the SNICA model. So here is the comprehensive list of all the new features and enhancements listed on the first column, the left column. I highlighted the key updates by red, and on the middle column, then you can see the new name list controls added to the CRM CTSM to accommodate these new features and enhancement. And on the right column, the last column shows the original and current CTSM SNICA name list or features. So first, we update the ICE optical properties to include multiple different options, and specifically the default one has been updated to this Pika et al. 2016, which is more updated compared to the original ones and more correct based on the recent measurements. We also updated the aerosol optical properties. We include the particularly, we include multiple dust options or types. So the default one is set to the Sahara dust, which is in the middle of the range. And this is also updated compared to the older one. We also update the downward solar spectra, which includes multiple, like 6 different downward solar spectras. Originally, we only have this mid-latitude winter. Now we have mid-latitude winter, summer, subarctic winter, summer, Greenland, and also high mountain. We also include the more accurate radiation transfer solver compared to the older one, which is the 2-stream. And also we included the non-spherical snow grain parameterizations, the black carbon or soot snow internal mixing, dust snow internal mixing schemes. And for the snow shape, particularly, we include 4 different representative snow shapes, and we set the hexagonal plates shape to be default compared to the sphere ones based on the observations. And finally, we also include a hyperspectral capability, which includes the 10 nanometer spectral resolution for the calculations. Originally, we only have the 5-band narrow band calculations, but for the 480 bands, we are able to very accurately assimilate the albedo. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you the sensitivity by using these new features and enhancements in a global setup for the CTSM CRM simulations. Here is the brief setup for these global simulations. We are doing this for 1 degree and use this SP setup. And the first 5 years for spin up and the last 5 years for analysis. So quickly here, I'm showing this new updated ice refracting index or optics compared to the old one shown as this blue line here. So essentially, we have a stronger ice visible absorption, and then and hence we have this slightly lower albedo in the new ice optics. And here I'm showing you the global sensitivities. So as you can see, the major difference are on the are in the high latitudes. But it's very small. It's less than 0.01. So, but we are going towards the correct direction or accurate directions. And then the next one is to show you the impact of this aerosol optics for this snow albedo difference. So let me see. So here I'm showing you the all-sky direct and diffuse albedo difference by using the new simulation, new data set minus the old data set in the simulation. As we can see here, first, you notice this lower snow albedo over most of the northern hemisphere. This is caused by the stronger aerosol absorption due to the updated aerosol optics, and then we have this lower snow albedo. And here, this map showing you the enhanced aerosol albedo reduction due to the updated optics. And then what's interesting is that this very high sensitivity in the high latitude caused by these updated downward solar spectral weights. We are still using the mid-latitude winter as the old one or default CLM, but slightly updated the fraction of the different bands shown as here. The blue one is the old one, the old spectral, and the red one is a new spectral. Even for this tiny difference, then you can see here we have up to 0.02 or 0.03 difference in the albedo. And here, to confirm our explanation, we also conducted the standalone version of the SNECA simulations by using the different spectra. And you do see this difference in the diffuse snow albedo. So this reminds us of the very high snow albedo sensitivity to the downward spectra at high latitudes. Okay, so here again, showing you the aerosol-induced surface radiative forcing difference caused by the updated aerosol optical properties. As you can see, we have a stronger dust radiative forcing.
That is 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. So, and we also have enhanced organic carbon, but reduced black carbon radiative forcing. So next, I'm showing you the sensitivity to the multiple dust types due to their different optics. As you can see here, they have quite different absorption for the light for solar radiation, and the snow albedo difference between the Greenland dust and the Colorado dust as shown here. So they do show the noticeable and important difference in the albedo reduction caused by dust over almost all the northern hemisphere. Another one is the effect of the updated, more accurate radiation transfer solver. As you can see here, the old solver shows very high overestimates at the NIR bands, but the new solver substantially reduced these overestimates, especially for the NIR bands, as well as some of the visible bands. So here, by using this new solver compared to the old solver, we do see a higher direct NIR albedo for the snow over the globe, mainly over the high latitudes, but we do see this lower diffuse NIR albedo. This is because the original overestimated snow albedo bias has been removed. Okay, so I will very quickly show you the impact of the higher snow albedo for the non-spherical snow, because if we assume the different shapes for the snow grains, non-spherical shapes, then we will have a higher snow albedo due to their optical properties difference. And here I'm showing you the snow albedo difference over the globe for our sky situation. You can see this albedo difference can be up to 0.05. And then this snow shape would also affect the aerosol surface radiative effect due to the snow aerosol interactions, which essentially reduce the aerosol-induced snow albedo effect. And then we also implemented the
we should probably wrap up.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, I'm showing you here the reasons for why we need the hyperspectral capability and the compared to the 5 bands. And I listed the reasons here, and I will just leave here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sunlin. If anybody has questions for Sunlin, please put them in the chat. Sunlin, if you can stop sharing. Next, we have Yelin Jian. Yeah, so go ahead, and looks like we're just seeing your desktop background. There you go. Yeah, and then remember to unmute yourself before you start talking.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, thanks Anka for the opportunity to share our current studies. And I'm Yelin Jiang, PhD student from University of Connecticut. This study is advised by Dr. Nywon, and my topic today is a new approach to soil initialization for studying subseasonal land atmosphere interactions. Previous study has indicated the important role of soil moisture in the drought development. As we can see in the figure, the decrease in soil moisture will decrease the evapotranspiration due to the low water availability. And then less evaporative cooling will increase the land surface temperature, and less moisture supply from land surface will decrease the precipitation. Both increase in temperature and decrease in precipitation will increase drought events, and then it will lower the soil moisture and form the feedback loop. In addition to the impacts of the soil moisture, soil temperature also plays a very important role in the land-atmosphere interactions. In order to better understand the role of the land-atmosphere interactions, tons of sensitivity tests have been carried out during the past 20 years. Previous studies, they typically firstly identify a rectangle region as a targeted area, then impose the soil anomalies to the targeted region only, and then for the soil conditions elsewhere, they are still the same as control. There have two disadvantages for the conventional approach. First, it will create the sharp contrast across the boundary of the targeted areas for the soil initializations. And then it will result in the unrealistic spatial patterns of soil conditions at the continuation scale. For example, taking the conventional approach, this figure shows the spatial pattern of soil temperature in response to the warming in the targeted area. And we can see the surrounding areas, they have the cooling signal, while the targeted area has a warming signal. That's not realistic. In realistic, the soil temperature is characterized with a certain degree of spatial correlations. We can see in the regression coefficient map, the surrounding regions here should follow a certain degree of change in response to the warming in the targeted areas. To account for the realistic spatial correlation of soil conditions, we propose a new approach to soil initializations. We name it as the slope approach. Here, we use the soil temperature as an example. Firstly, we need to calculate the spatially average soil temperature over the targeted region, for example, Northeast region, and then derive the linear regression slope Sij between the spatial average and the soil temperature at every grid point everywhere in South America. Then derive the temperature anomaly over the target region through delta T equal to T initial minus T control. For each grid point elsewhere, we derive the soil temperature anomaly through delta Tij equal to Sij multiply delta T. Here is to constructed initial conditions for the soil temperature. We can see here these two figures are all realistic soil initialization with spatial continuity. And these two figures show the similar spatial patterns for the soil initialization targeting different regions. To compare our approach with the conventional approach, we designed multiple experiments. Firstly, we have a long control experiments. We use the CSM2 global simulation with the prescribed sea surface temperature and the sea ice fraction at FO9 spatial resolution over 1980 to 2018. The long simulation served as reference case for the short experiments, and also it generates initial conditions for multiple short simulations. And then it provides a long time record for the soil temperature and moisture statistics. After that, we have multiple 1 month short simulations, hot, cool, wet, and dry experiments. They employ the slope approach with different soil initializations. For example, the hot experiment is initialized with 99% soil temperature. And for the soil moisture for this experiment, it directly comes from control. We run them separately in each September and November from 2006, 2015, and targeting the Southern Amazon and the Montasir region. Also, we run the short simulation with conventional approach.
I am not. I'm waiting for it.
Could you all please make sure that you're muted? Jacquelyn, go ahead and continue.
Also, we ran the short simulation with conventional approach to soil initialization just in 2015 as a reference. The weather in 2015 is extremely hot and dry over the tropical South American, and therefore it has been chosen as a case study. Here we define the soil temperature responses as the difference between the hot and cool experiment. And we define the soil moisture responses as the difference between the dry and the wet experiments. These two figures show the soil memory of the slow approach and conventional approach in year 2015. We can see the soil memory for moisture is almost 1 month, and for the temperatures, just like 10 days. Within the targeted region, the temperature variability in soil anomaly are qualitatively similar between two soil initialization approaches. The signal of the slope approach, here we can see the red line, is a little bit stronger than the blue line in the conventional approach. We compare the simulated temperature from the slope and the conventional approach. In addition, we compare the spatial patterns with the pattern from the long simulation and for ERA5 for reanalysis. We can see the warming signal over both the targeted region and the surrounding region in both long simulation and for ERA5 reanalysis. And also, unlike the conventional approach, there is no sharp contrast for our slope approach. In addition to the more realistic results, slope approach have the potential to reduce the computational cost. Here is two figures show the similarity in the soil temperature initialization, which has showed in previous page. And also we can see the similarity in the soil memory length. And also we can see the similarity in hydrometeorological responses to soil temperature change. These two experiments are targeting different regions using the slope approach. This similarity means we only need to run one group of experiments targeting one area, which is enough for presenting the result of experiments targeting different regions. Here are also the similarity between experiments targeting different regions using slope approach, but that's for the variable soil moisture. We can see the similarity in soil moisture initialization, the qualitatively similarity in soil moisture length, and for the similarity in hydrometeorological responses to the soil moisture change. In summary, we propose a new slope approach to soil initialization for study the subseasonal land-atmosphere interaction. The slope approach is superior to the conventional approach in three perspectives. First, it has the realistic spatial patterns of the soil temperature and moisture, and it will not create the sharp contrast across the boundary of the targeted area, and it can increase the computation efficient. This study is funded by NSF, and the computational resource is provided by NCAR. Now, more information, please visit our group website. Thank you.
Great, Jacquelyn, thank you. That was perfect timing.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone has questions, I think we have a minute or two. And Marisa, if you wanted to get your talk, if you wanted. Okay, it doesn't look like any questions are popping up immediately, but if you have questions, please add them to the chat. Our next speaker will be Marisa Legou. So, yeah, it looks like you're unmuted and you're sharing your screen, so everything looks good to go.
Super duper. Yeah, so this should be probably fairly short. It was just a neat little result that I stumbled across while playing with the model. And this is looking at how reductions in terrestrial evaporation actually lead to increased water vapor over land. This is all sort of for the modern looking Earth. Sorry, slides aren't advancing. There they go. Okay, so typically we think about reducing evaporation from land as having a warming effect on the land surface, as was alluded to in the previous talk. And this is because you've basically got this energy budget on your surface where you've got energy coming in terms of sunshine and long wave radiation coming down from the atmosphere, and the Earth gets rid of it, or the land surface that is, gets rid of it either as evaporating water or by making the surface hotter, which increases your sensible heat fluxes and your emitted long wave radiation. So if you go and you make it really hard to evaporate water and reduce that latent heat flux term, all of that extra energy basically gets dumped into your upwards long wave radiation and your sensible heat flux terms, which is associated with an increase in surface temperature. And this is something that our models have been able to capture for a very long time. So this is a figure from a paper in 1982, where they have on the top panel a planet with really wet soils on the land surface, and the bottom panel is really dry soils. And the contours are showing you July surface temperatures. So really all that you see from this is that the contours are much more spaced out and much less high numbers when you have really wet soils, and then the land gets really hot when you have your dry soils. So less evaporation means hotter land, and everyone's kind of on board with that for the modern Earth. But what I really wanted to dig into here was looking at how reductions in land evaporation actually change atmospheric water vapor. And this is an important thing to understand because we care about how changes in water vapor impact things like relative humidity and VPD. These matter for vegetation on the land surface. Water vapor is a precursor to cloud formation and precipitation, and it's also a great greenhouse gas. So it has a lot of implications for sort of surface and planetary climate. And there's reasons you can imagine reducing land evaporation could alter atmospheric water vapor in both directions. So you might expect reducing evaporation from land to lead to less water vapor over the continents because you're literally putting less water from the land up into the atmosphere. But you could also potentially expect it to lead to increases in water vapor because the vapor pressure of water increases as temperature increases. So that means if you have hotter air, it can hold more water if it can get that water from somewhere like a lake or the ocean. And then this is sort of further complicated by the fact that changes in circulation between the land and the ocean can also lead to unexpected shifts in water vapor over the continents. So what I'm going to show you are the results of some really end member simulations of possible land evaporation. So we're going to look at one that I'm calling desert land here. And this is sort of making land always dry everywhere. So you can imagine this as land that is just really, really efficient at draining. So like a gravel land surface that as soon as the water rains onto it, it immediately drains away and goes off into runoff. So you can't really have any water available to evaporate from the land surface. And we can compare that to the other extreme, which I'm going to call swampland, which is where we're forcing the land to be always saturated with water everywhere, regardless of how much precipitation it gets, regardless of its topography. And you can imagine this as a planet that has sort of a super fancy in-ground irrigation system. And we're doing these simulations with CESM, so a coupled atmosphere CAM5 with a slab ocean and a dynamic sea ice model. And then we're replacing CLM with SLIM, this idealized land surface model that allows us to set up these kind of ridiculous simulations where we're forcing a desert everywhere or forcing a swamp everywhere to really probe how those changes in evaporation impact the atmosphere. So to start off, we can just look at what the change in latent heat flux, so evaporation, was at the land surface. And this is the difference between our desert and our swamp simulation. Now the brown colors are showing you reductions in evaporation from the surface. So brown over land is good. It means we set up our simulations right. So we're turning off terrestrial evaporation. And we see that we do get increases in evaporation over the ocean regions though. And as expected, when we turn off evaporation over our continents, we get these big increases in surface temperature in our desert simulation compared to our swamp simulation. But then what's kind of neat and was surprising when I first looked at it was that we get these really big increases in total atmospheric water vapor over most regions of the planet, basically everywhere except the subsiding branches of the Hadley cell. And that's what these sort of teal colors are showing you on the panel on the right. So this is the column integrated water vapor. So the water vapor at every level stacked up. And while I'm showing you the column integrated values here, what's kind of neat is that the water vapor here is increasing not just near the surface or just aloft, it's really increasing throughout the whole column, which I'll show you later. So what that means is if we turn off evaporation from the land surface, you get an atmosphere with more water vapor in it over the land. So that's kind of weird. The increased moisture, though, it basically has to be coming from the ocean because we turned off evaporation from the land surface. But what's neat is that it's reaching right into the middle regions of the continent. It's not just increasing sort of at the coasts where you might expect it to be able to advect easily in. So there's two potential pathways that immediately come to mind for how more water vapor is ending up over our continental regions. The first option is just that because we turned off land evaporation, our planet is warmer, like we would expect. So if we have a generally warmer planet, that might lead to more evaporation from the ocean, and then we would have higher water vapor in sort of our free troposphere over the ocean regions, which might just be advecting over the continents. And if that was the main driver of what was happening, we would expect still our air that's sort of near the surface over the continents to be fairly dry, and then for the air higher up in the troposphere to be anomalously wet. The second option is that as we heat our land surface, we have this change in circulation where we've got more uplift over the land surface, and that's pulling moist air from the oceans onto the continents. And if that was the case, we would expect more moisture near the surface over the continents, especially near the coasts, but maybe not necessarily aloft. And it would also be kind of hard to drag it all the way into the middle of, say, like Eurasia. But if we just look at an averaged cross-section of what's happening to specific humidity, so this is like literally the grams of water in the air at every level. This is a zonal mean just over land regions from the South Pole on the left up to the North Pole on the right, going from the surface up to basically the tropopause. And what we see is that most regions are green, except again, right in those sort of subsiding branches of the Hadley cell near the surface. That means that we're getting more water vapor in our atmosphere throughout pretty much the whole column, which means we're probably getting a combination of both of these options where we've just got more water vapor in the atmosphere from the ocean, but we're also getting these changes in circulation that are leading to an increase in moisture near the surface. It's important to note, though, that even though we have literally more water in the atmosphere, we're still effectively getting drying over our land surface. So the left panel now is showing you the change in relative humidity just over land regions, zonally averaged. And in particular, what's important is that we do get these really strong red colors. So decreases in like 20 to 50% in the relative humidity over the land surface in the lower troposphere when we turn off evaporation. So even though there's more water in the air over the continents, because it's so hot, it still is effectively drier. And if we dig into what's actually driving this, what's really causing this change is a shift in atmospheric circulation where we've got this heating over the continent and it's leading to anomalous upwards motion over most land areas. So the red colors basically are showing you anomalous vertical motion where negative values here, the red ones are up just because pressure is basically upside down. And then the gray arrows, which are pretty small and hard to see, but if you can see them, they're sort of showing anomalous flow of air onto the continents near the surface. And specifically, if we just look at what's happening in the equator, because it tells a pretty tidy story, and we just look at a cross-section of that anomalous vertical motion, what we see is that we've got this really strong anomalous vertical motion over the continents that's being driven by the land getting really hot. So it's basically dry convection here that's driving this, as opposed to sort of moist convection that we typically think of as happening in the tropics. So it's this anomalous heating at the surface that drives really strong upwards motion that pulls in moist air from the continents, and it just shoots it all the way up through the full depth of the troposphere. But what's kind of neat is that only part of this surface heating and this anomalous upwards motion is driven by the warming that's directly due to less evaporation. And to tease that apart, we can do something called a radiative kernel decomposition, which this bar graph is showing you. And this bar graph has a ton going on, so you can ignore most of it, but it's basically a way of saying how much extra energy do we get into the surface, the positive values, as a result of shifts in evaporation, that's the first one, or changes in water vapor, clouds, temperatures, so on. Really, all you need to care about are two pieces of this. The fact that less evaporation means more energy to heat the surface. That's this middle gray bar. and the fact that less evaporation also means much less cloud cover over the land surface. That means more shortwave radiation into the land surface, and that leads to actually even more heating of the land than that initial reduction in evaporation did on its own. So really, it's this cloud loss that is driving just as much surface heating that drives this anomalous circulation as the reduction in evaporation in the first place. So really all I did here was we looked at how suppressing land evaporation can actually drive increases in water vapor over both land and ocean regions. And it's because this heating of the land surface induces an anomalous atmospheric circulation that brings in water from the ocean. But only part of that heating is due to having a hotter surface. The rest of it is actually due to reductions in cloud cover. Then you've got a really hot surface that drags in ocean air and it just shoots it up into the atmosphere because you've got really strong anomalous dry convection. Yeah, so with that, I'll end.
Perfect timing, Marisa. That was
Yeah,
great.
thanks, Marisa.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes for questions. It looks like there's one in the chat already. It says, I may have missed it, but how would precipitation respond?
No, you didn't miss it. I didn't show it in the interest of time. You get huge reductions in precipitation over most land areas, with the exception of the tropics, where you get increases along the west coast of South America, not over the Amazon, because we've effectively killed precipitation recycling in our desert simulation. Big increases in tropical Africa and big increases over the maritime continent. But outside of the tropics, you get big reductions in rainfall.
Great, thank you. Dave has a question. He has his hand raised.
Yeah, so nice talk. If you did something slightly more realistic, you know, like the Southwest US as an example, getting drier.
Yeah.
Have you considered doing that and seeing, you know, are you going to see a circulation change?
Yeah,
You know?
I've definitely considered doing it. I have not explicitly done it for the Southwest US. What I'm really curious in is if you sort of incrementally did this reduction in evaporation, if there is a place where it like peaks or shifts direction. Like, it's not obvious to me that, I think initially you could reduce evaporation and that might lead to less water vapor. And only once you've reduced it so much that you can drive this massive anomalous circulation do you get more. So I feel like there's probably an optimum in there somewhere. And that probably depends on the region and the strength of evaporation reduction.
Yeah, thank you, Marisa. Sanjeev, would you like to share your screen? Next talk is, well, Arshdeep Singh is the lead author, but Sanjeev Kumar is going to present in place of Arshdeep.
Thank you, Danica. Yeah, today I'm going to present students' work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I'll tell you in the next slide why I'm presenting Arshdeep work. And the title is Soil Moisture Modulates Land Use Change Impact Under Global Warming. This is an update from the talk that Arshdeep gave in the winter meeting. So yeah, the day before yesterday night, like he emailed me like there was a storm in his research field and he need to go to the research field to replant the corn. So that's why I'm presenting his talk. Okay, land use change is increasing. So what you see in the left-hand side is the crop percentage increase in the present climate in the top and the future climate in the bottom. And the time series plot that is shown on the right-hand side shows the land use change or the percentage cropland in the two scenarios. So in the historical case, both are the same, but as we go into the future climate, most of the land use change are taking place in the middle, in the lower latitude, mostly tropics. You find that there is a land use change increasing in India, but when it comes to either North America or Eurasia, there is not much difference between RCP 585 and RCP SSP 126. So this is important, the way we analyze the land use change. There have been some literature in terms of how the land use change impact can change in the future climate, and we have heard about reduction in the snow cover, and that can impact the land use change, impact on climate. There is a CO2 physiological response. We heard about the feeding back to the cloud cover and precipitation, and also due to dynamic vegetation changes. So there have been individual studies which have used the individual climate model and to come up with a slightly different answer. And here the goal was to analyze the land use change using the new set of the experiment and in terms of the multimodal assessment, and see if we can get some consistent response. And also, we would separate the local impact from the total impact by comparing the climate change impact in the two neighboring regions, where in one region it has seen the land use change, in other region it has not seen the land use change. And then develop a mechanistic understanding why land use change impact is changing. And finally, we will bring some robustness of the result using the CSM2 LE data set. Here is the multimodal mean from the CMAP6 climate model. In the leftmost column, you see the total impact. That's basically the difference between all forcing run and then no LU run. And we see the widespread cooling impact in the at least in the mid-latitude region due to land use change in the historical climate. It occurs both in terms of the annual as well as the JJ season. When we separated the local impact that is in the middle column, that also shows a cooling impact due to land use change in the mid-latitude and also parts of the tropical region. In the future climate, we cannot do the total impact because there is not much land use change between RCP 8.5 and then SSP 585 and SSP 126. So we did only local impact in the future climate, and what we find that it's converting into from the cooling impact to a overall warming impact in the mid-latitude region. If you see the rightmost column here, and then in the tropical region like India, the cooling impact get strengthened in the future climate. So we wanted to understand why it is changing the sign from the historical climate to the future climate. Here is some intermodal variation or the spread in the land use change impact. Again, the two columns represent annual and JJA. There is some intermodal variability or spread in terms of land use change impact. You see the total impact, you see historical local impact. I think the main story is, when we go from the historical local to the future local impact, most of the models show a consistent increase in the temperature for North America and Eurasia, and consistent decrease in temperature for the tropical region like India, and across both annual as well as the JJA. We investigated in terms of its driver. One is related to how much albedo is changing due to land use change, and that mostly follows the land use change trajectory. That means if land use change is not increasing, you would not say much increase in the albedo. Whereas the land use change increases in India, so you see the increase in the albedo. However, another factor that comes into the play in the mid-latitude is the soil moisture drying. That is shown in the bottom row, and soil moisture dries out in both North America and Eurasia land use change region, and it increases in the India land use change region, and that is mainly due to increase in the precipitation in India region. So we use a simple equation to understand different drivers. the DTE is the total evaporative cooling, or the warming if the soil moisture dries. And then there are some constant terms that we derived using the multi-model mean value in out of 6 climate model. And then S is the soil moisture. So one thing we suspected that, yeah, soil moisture is coming in the denominator. So if it is decreasing, then it might have a increasing impact on the temperature. There is a change DS, that's change in the soil moisture, and we'll come back to this term later on. DF is that's how we are controlling the radiative impact or the albedo driven impact in this formula. So using this simple formula, we can test the sensitivity of the different terms, what can drive the land use change impact in the future climate. So we did a lot of calibration here, and in the top row, you see the calibrated results. We use the multimodal mean of C, V, and S to calibrate the model for the present and the future climate. For the present climate has been represented by the blue color, and then future climate is the red color. And we obtained a reasonable calibration, like as shown by the R square. So we calibrated the model using only the multimodal mean, and as we put all the 6 climate model results, it shows a reasonable calibration as demonstrated by the R square value. Once we calibrated the model, we started taking out the one term out of the equation once at a time. So we first took out the DS term, replace it to the historical value, and it has the largest impact in terms of the while land use change impact is changing in the future climate. We also replaced V, that is a vapor pressure deficit, using the historical climate value, and it has some impact, but its impact was not as large as the DS impact. And yeah, initially we started with the assumption that this is S that is causing more of the warming, but in this formula, it was the DS that was causing most of the warming impact in this future climate. Okay, so finally, we tested our result using the CSM 200 member large ensemble. So you see how the land use change impacting the surface temperature in the North America land use change region, and it slowly weakens as we go through from 1995 to 2085. So this data point represents like 30-year average value. And yeah, it almost from -0.9 to it reaches to 0.2 negative 0.2 value in the future climate. And opposite occurs in the India, where land use change impact get more cooling in the land use change region in India.
Sanjeev, that is 10 minutes.
Okay, this is my conclusion slide, so I'll leave it there for some questions.
Great, thank you, Sanjeev. I see that Abby put a question in the chat. Did these runs have coupled atmospheres, or were they land only?
No, coupled. These are the CMAP6 run. So these are the fully coupled run I took out of the CMAP6 archive.
Okay, thank you. And Dave has his hand up.
Sanjeev, nice. I feel like I asked the same question last time you presented this, but I'll ask again because I don't remember the answer. You know, if you're looking at, like, say, the North America one, and you're saying that the impact of land use change is reducing, right? Less of a cooling. So are you talking about if you did land use change occurring in 2080, like somebody cut down more forest in 2080, the impact is smaller, or are you saying that the whole region is responding differently to land use change that might have happened back in their, you know, historical period? I guess I'm not. Do you understand my question?
I guess I did not understand your question.
Okay, I think I might have to ask you in person, because I think I'm missing a key feature here. So I'll try to write it.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Sanjeev. Bowen, did you want to share your screen? Great, thank you. So our next speaker will be Bowen Feng. And so if you want to unmute your, we can see your screen.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm Bowen Feng, a PhD student at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and it's my great pleasure today to share with you some this project we've been working on, where we implemented a dynamic urban scheme in the CESM, and this hopefully makes CESM the first fully coupled Earth system model that resolves urbanization over time. So in this discussion, I'll give a brief introduction to the background and motivation of the project, and then go into a little bit of technical details about the implementation of the transient urban scheme, followed by a recent set of simulation, some results we are satisfied with, and some next steps. So first, some background. CTSM or CLM has been a very powerful tool for land simulation. And one highlight we found especially important is its transient land use mechanism, where some land use types, including natural vegetation, including crops, could change throughout the simulation. This allows for a more flexible and hopefully more accurate representation of the landscape. The glacier is already dynamic, and the modification to bring transient lake is almost there. And all that leaves urban the only missing piece before we can make this whole model dynamic. So our work was designed to fill that gap, transient urban. So that leads to the motivation of the project. We know urban has a relatively small area. However, with the rapid urbanization in the future, the combined effect of the addition of impervious urban surface and the loss of the natural or vegetated surface could combine and actually make a difference in terms of the regional climate. And more, we also want to model how the global climate actually impacts the more and more urbanized cities, and how we can deal with that with mitigation and adaptation strategies. And none of those can be studied if the urbanization level is kept static, as was the case prior to our implementation. So in short, the model cannot be called fully realistic without considering the dynamics of urbanization. With that introduction, let's talk about some details, how we make this happen. It will be a relatively higher level summary, but I'd be very happy to discuss in more details if anyone's interested. So basically the process of the implementation consists of 4 major tasks or steps. The first one being data preparation. So here is what the raw data looks like. It's in binary format, and it's at 1 kilometer resolution, meaning that a pixel can either be urban or non-urban. However, the model doesn't take that data format. It would rather divide urban into 3 categories. So tall building district, high density, and medium density. And each density type will have different properties. So we will need to manually assign density types to these urban regions. And we also had to reconcile some urban growth with other land use change. And finally, we got this land use time series data that's ready to be used by CESM. And the second step will involve some higher level modification. We did that change in the control module so that the model can read in the land use time series file we made earlier and update the urban areas each year. This is very straightforward, but the only one issue here is when urban first appear in a grid cell, we need to initialize it so that it can, some of the state variables can start from a relatively realistic condition. So to simplify things, initially we try to initialize urban everywhere, but that would cause a burden in performance and memory. So later we have an improved approach where when we created the land use time series file in the previous step, we add a variable called the percentage of urban max, which corresponds to the maximum of urban fractions throughout the whole simulation for a given grid cell. So with that variable, we can tell where urban exists or will grow, and we can initialize urban only for those places. So for our specific input data, you can see the urbanization trends as expected. And the next steps involve some lower level modification to the model. This is a simplified version. So when urban expands, certain other land use types will shrink, of course. And we carefully check that during this land conversion, the water and energy are conserved. So when the land use change happens at the beginning of each year, the difference in total water or energy contents before and after the change can be accounted for by a balancing term or balance flux, and that flux is spread out throughout the whole year. And with some treatment for the carbon pool, namely missing, we also ensure the same for mass conservation. So we ensure conservation of mass and energy here. And finally, we made this game for the community, and we understand there are multiple excellent urbanization projection data set. And we want to make it as simple as possible for other users to supply their own urbanization data. When we started this project, we compiled the data set all manually, but later we found out there's a existing infrastructure called Make Surf Data Map tool. With some modification, it can be used to generate the land use time series data we desire. So this is still work in progress, but I believe it will be available very soon. So that's a quick summary of the workflow. And we recently tested the implementation with some simple simulation. And I'd like to share with you some simple results. So first, the setup of the simulation. It's also very straightforward. We use a pair of I-mode simulation, so land-only simulations. And the only difference between the two cases would be with or without dynamic urban scheme. To clarify, we use the new code after modification for both cases. And for the static urban, we just feed the model with a land use time series that has urban won't change throughout the simulation. And for the dynamic urban case, it of course updates annually. And here is a quick visualization of dynamic urban and the static urban. So this is a plot showing the urban expansion in terms of fraction of grid cell area. And we picked some places to see how dynamic urban actually makes a difference. This is a region near New York, and it experienced rapid urbanization. And in this center plot, the urban fraction is shown as the size of the dots, and the urban 2-meter daily average temperature is the color of the dot, and with the color bar on the right. So we generally see a warming trend with urban sprawl, which is expected. And the vertical axis of those dots is the difference between dynamic urban and static urban. So in terms of the grid cell average surface temperature, so we can see the difference between dynamic urban and the static urban is expanding. And that's the difference we want to show by implementing a dynamic urban scheme. And we can easily find the similar trends in other parts of the world, like in California, like in near Sydney, Australia. And once again, this set of simulation are offline. They are not fully coupled, since only the land component is fully active. So we must acknowledge that we won't be able to capture any two-way interaction between land and atmosphere, and the urbanization effect we show here is rather limited. And that leads to our conclusion and next steps. So so in conclusion, we implemented a transient urban scheme and it's tested to work great. And we believe it has some great potential for further investigation. And for next steps, we recognize the limitation of this land-only experiment. We have actually started and got some preliminary results from a fully coupled simulation, and that one is definitely more promising to show some more insights into the physical science behind urbanization, as well as the whole climate under this dynamic urbanization. And we are also trying to introduce more details of the project with some manuscript. Most of this project has already been made public here, and everyone is welcome to try that. So, well, this work was accomplished with the guidance from my advisor, Dr. Lei Zhao, and our collaborator, Dr. Keith Olson from NCAR, as well as numerous scientists there. And also—
Hey, Bowen, that is 10 minutes. Thank you.
Sorry, yeah. And also Cora Zhang from Yale University, she contributed a lot, and she's currently working on the fully coupled simulation. And we hope this presentation is of some help to anyone who is interested in this new feature. And please let us know if anything can be improved. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Bowen. There are two questions for you in the chat. We have just 1 minute for questions, so I'll read the first one and maybe you can answer the second one in the chat. But the first one says, how do you determine or assign the urban types for each 1 kilometer grid?
Oh, okay, because currently, although the urban is static, there's—
Can you also stop sharing your screen while you're answering the question? Thank you.
Sorry. Currently, the urban part of the model is static. It's not dynamic, but it's already the infrastructure is there. And from what's already there, the urban is divided into 3 density types according to a data set coming with the model. I believe it's supplied by Jackson et al. And we just base our urbanization data set on that existing model, and we will ensure the partitioning of different density types resemble what's already there. So that's the basic idea of this partitioning.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you have a few other questions in the chat, so if you want to read through those and answer those in the chat, that would be great. Our next talk is by Brett Raxa. Brett, we can see your screen, and yeah, just unmute and go ahead.
Perfect. Thanks, Tonica. And so, yes, I'm an associate scientist in the data assimilation research section at NCAR, and today I'll be talking about some of the results using our ensemble data assimilation software coupled with CLM. Just want to thank the rest of our DART group and also the university collaborators whose some work that I'll be presenting today. And so just some motivation for using data assimilation. So in general, it's used to reduce CLM or system model uncertainty and improve forecasting skill. And so the best way to kind of put it in context is comparing against other modes of CLM. So CLM-BGC, the full biogeochemistry, has really no external constraints. It's kind of driven by meteorological forcing, internally prognostic, but sometimes can be prone to error and uncertainty due to how you've initialized it, boundary conditions, and then parametric and structural error. And so that's why there's motivation in previous talks today to optimize and estimate, get a better estimate of parameters. One way to try to reduce that uncertainty is to try different modes. So CLM, SP, and satellite phenology mode, which is essentially prescribing the leaf area and vegetation directly into the model, reducing that uncertainty. I've heard this today that there's also a mode to prescribe in soil moisture as well. CLM Dart, so CLM coupled with the DA system kind of goes a step beyond this. And so essentially you can constrain CLM simulations with any observed land surface property, preferably one that's simulated closely simulated by CLM. And it also produces uncertainty estimates, and those are very useful depending upon who's looking at your results. And so why is this so important and interesting? Well, there's been an explosion of satellite observations over the last decade. And so this gives us kind of unprecedented opportunity to look at different land surface features. So anything from solar-induced fluorescence, land surface temperature, biomass, soil moisture. This is something that we can observe from remote sensing platforms. I will note you usually have to use caution when using these as well, because there's a lot of science that goes in from what they're measuring, which is, spectral radiance bands, and then converting those into land surface properties or interpreting those. And so as an end user, you have to be careful in terms of what the uncertainty estimates are and what they're actually measuring. But these are often used in tandem to complement our ground-based networks. So many are familiar with the Nywon and Ameriflux eddy covariance tower sites. And so these together give us a lot of opportunity to constrain the Earth system. So a little bit more about the Bayesian approach with CLM Dart. It is general combination of these Earth system observations with some uncertainty, giving us a likelihood, prior forecast generated from CLM, also with an uncertainty, combining those together and getting an answer somewhere in between. So it's not a prescription approach. And so a little bit more detail, we drive our ensembles through the CAM, the atmospheric model, and CESM, and so through Dart. And so this ensemble reanalysis, if you want to know more about that, Kevin Rader's running a poster on that. We have as many as 80 different realizations of the atmosphere that probe the uncertainty in the atmospheric state, and that's used to drive the uncertainty in CLM. This gives us a forecast uncertainty. We run that until we come into contact with an observation in time. We then estimate that observation based upon what CLM expects to see, and then we update CLM to better match that observation, regress that information on the rest of the CLM state for an improved forecast. And so this is just a review of some of the work that we've been working on so far. So a lot of emphasis has been placed on assimilating in leaf area and biomass data. And so this has been across the Western United States, the Arctic boreal domain, and across the globe. And here we're just assimilating. So I should say, this is looking at a variety of different resolution types, a variety of different observation products. But one consensus we've found across the three is that when you assimilate in LAI and above ground biomass, you're reducing the simulated biomass within CLM. So here I'm just showing you're showing about a 30% reduction in the simulated leaf area and biomass, 30 and 70% reduction in the Arctic boreal domain, and a 26% reduction across the globe. And so you could see a lot of that reduction is within forested regions. So like the high terrain of the Western United States, forested regions in Alaska, Northern Canada, and then across the globe as well. So one thing we can kind of look at is what does that impact on the carbon cycle? So just digging a little bit closer into two of those analyses, the Western United States and the Arctic boreal region. Here I'm comparing CLM and CLM-5 Dart against an independent benchmark. So the FluxCom machine learning benchmark, and looking at the seasonal cycle, the component fluxes. And then in this work here, looking a little bit closer using the ILAM benchmarking software. So evaluating CLM, the free run, and with Dart against metrics such as bias and RMSE, showing this relative scale where the better values are the colder, the bluer colors, and showing improvement. And one thing that's fairly consistent is when you assimilate in leaf and biomass, you're showing more consistency with the component fluxes, GPP and RE, compared to these independent benchmarks. So both in the seasonal cycle getting closer, and then also in this Arctic boreal work, showing improvements in the gross primary productivity and the ecosystem respiration. This improvement also goes into the hydrological cycle, so getting a better estimate or a more consistent estimate with the benchmark of evapotranspiration, latent heat, and sensible heat. Another thing to look at is that we're not getting more consistency in metrics that are historically challenging to estimate, and that's net ecosystem production, for example. So just isolating that this generally, or net ecosystem exchange did not come into more consistency with the independent benchmarks, in this case, both on a seasonal cycle shown here, and also the spatial distribution of NEP wasn't exactly the distribution that we would expect. You would generally expect the higher elevations to be more of a sink of carbon, where the lower elevations would be a source. And here we're not generally seeing that pattern. And then we definitely see that consistency in the Arctic boreal region, the net ecosystem exchange in the soil carbon, and also the snow water equivalent kind of become more deprecated or lose the consistency with the independent benchmarks. And so sort of what that does is it motivates assimilating in additional data streams to better constrain what is going on. So soil moisture and snow or snow water equivalent, soil carbon data to better get at ecosystem respiration. We have the flux tower network that we can depend on, and also kind of the newer data sets of solar induced fluorescence, which are tightly linear related to GPP. But for interest of time, I'll just talk about soil moisture and snow work. So this is some of the soil moisture assimilation work we've done across China. And so the free run on the left and CLM with DART on the right, and showing increased correlation with the ERA5 soil moisture benchmark here. And so I should say the observations we're assimilating in is a composite observation set of SMOS, SMAP, and the AMSRAE satellite platforms as well. And so showing improved correlation at the surface. So what's it doing in the subsurface? So when we assimilate that in, it's actually improving the correlation at the subsurface as well, as measured by site level in situ measurements of soil moisture, so that improvement is descending all the way down to about, I'm showing 100 centimeters here. We're hoping to investigate how much further this goes down. And so the interesting part here is that's what's in the root zone. And so this should have impacts on the carbon cycle. And so what we want to go do going forward is investigate, what this adjustment does to the GPP, the carbon cycle, and soil respiration. If you're interested in carbon cycling perspective. Also, I'm kind of stealing a slide from the Earth System Prediction Working Group in terms of sub-seasonal prediction of the atmosphere. And so here's generally a slide that suggests about the 3 to 4 week time period, the land is actually impacting forecasting scale even more than ocean and the atmosphere in this case. So there's applications for land atmosphere coupling work here as well. And then just finally, some examples of snow assimilation. And so we have a history of assimilating in MODIS snow cover fraction and GRACE terrestrial water storage here. And so it's just showing here some of the adjustments between the assimilated run and the free run with no observations, and showing some changes in the snow cover fraction and the snow water equivalent, and also improvement in simulating snow water depth. And so where we want to bring this to is we're adapting this into the newer CLM-5 and creating a repartitioning scheme. So we can more directly bring in data sets of snow water equivalent, adjust the total column of snow water equivalent, and then repartition that across the different snow layers. And so that's what we're mostly focused on now. And of course, that has implications for albedo and surface energy balance. And just wrapping up, in order to get a larger user group, we're kind of investing more in tutorial material. And so we had kind of some more simpler material that's kind of investigating some of the tools of DART using a simple toy model. We've added a detailed tutorial using CLM and DART, and just kind of showing some of the details of what we've included in this to help just get a larger user groups, and showing people examples of how to run through a CLM DART assimilation.
Hey, Brett, that is 10 minutes.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Danica. And so if you have any other questions, contact me or go to our website. Thanks.
Thank you, Brett. If you want to sharing, if anyone has questions, we have, I think, a minute before we get Chang Yang set up. And I'll just mention that Shweli said that the tutorial is very helpful for running DART CLM. So that's That's great.
Good feedback.
And Dave says great use of ILAM. Okay, so for our last talk of the day, model working group session, I should say, that we'll have Chang'an Xu. So Chang'an, if you just unmute, it looks like we can already see your screen.
Okay, great. So can you hear me? Okay,
yep.
Great. I really appreciate, I have technical issues to log in this morning. So thank you for accommodating this presentation. So this is really, we're using the DOE-sponsored dynamic vegetation model called FATES, and then with a plant hydrodynamic model, trying to better understand how the future climate change is going to really impact the light fuel moisture and the wildfire risk for a chaparral system in California. And this work is really done by postdoc Uma, but he left Lano, got a new job. But I just going to quickly go through this, and then we have a paper published last year. So if you're more interested on that, you can go to the paper. So why are we thinking about the light fuel moisture? The main motivation here is really thinking about the existing fire models, this from fine scale, landscape scale to global scale models. Most of the models mainly only consider the dead fuel moisture, but they do not consider light fuel moisture. So we feel like it's important that we consider light fuel moisture, mainly because it's going to play a really important role, for example, in terms of crown fire. When the flames high and then get to the crown, and then the light fuel moisture could be really important for the trees, but at the same time for the chaparral system where the shrub is low. So that light fuel moisture can also play a really important role in terms of fire spread and the fire burn area as well. And this paper back in 2009 by Dennis and Mortis, they have analyzed the cumulative burn area for the California chaparral system, and against the light fuel moisture content, we can see that it's a very nonlinear dynamic threshold behavior here. 70% of the light fuel moisture content, then we see a substantial increase of the cumulative burn area there. So indicating that it's really important that we potentially should incorporate the light fuel moisture content. So in this study, as mentioned at the very beginning, we are using the DOE-sponsored FATES. We're specifically using a module called the plant hydrodynamic model called FATES Hydro here. The hydrodynamic model really trying to track the water transportation from the rhizosphere to the absorbing root, transporting root, the stem, and also the leaf water tissue as well. So the model solving all this based on the water content here. So in this case, we able to track the water storage at different tissues. So in this, and we are able to use that to link to the light fuel moisture. So it allows us to estimate how light fuel moisture is going to change under future climate change. So we specifically looking at three hypotheses here. There's multiple factors going to impact the light fuel moisture in the future, and warming clearly going to reduce light fuel moisture because of the higher transpiration loss. But at the same time, the CO2 polarization, they're going to preserve the water storage in the leaf and tissues, mainly because the CO2 normally reduces the model conductance. So that's one the hypothesis. We feel like we test the hypothesis that warming has a strong impact. And then the second hypothesis, we're thinking about the seasonal cycle here. We're thinking about the reduction in precipitation during the spring and autumn going to make a longer fire seasons if we use the light fuel moisture content based on 75% as a criteria here. And then finally, we're testing the third hypothesis, really looking at the combined effect of warming and precipitation. I think it's larger than the individual impact add together. So that's just interactive component here. So, so this is, before we apply this model, we do calibrate the model so that the model captures the observed light fuel moisture in the field. And this is the monthly measurement of the stunt. I just mentioned that this is the stunt range for our study site. A lot of measurement there. And this is the red line indicating the model simulation, and the blue line indicating the field observation. We do use some ensemble simulation here to estimate the best parameter combination that best fit observations here. And I do want to point out at the beginning, the model tracked the water content in the leaf and also the stem, but they really did not target of live fuel moisture. Live fuel moisture is a combination of the leaf and the small branches there. So we use empirical equations here to estimate the live fuel moisture content based on leaf water content simulated by the model here. So overall, this is just one. We have simulated 3 PFD of the shrub system, and this is just one of the PFD, and we're looking at live fuel moisture content. The model overall able to reasonably capture the seasonal cycles, and we are able to look at actually a much longer the historical period in the Chaparral system. The model also able to reduce the interannual variabilities at a much longer time scale as well. And in this study, we mainly looking at the fire season length based on the threshold as identified by Dennis and Morris et al. Using 75% as a criteria, and then this is just a illustration here in the model based on the 2 emission scenarios, LCP 4.5 and LCP 8.5 here. So we how the fire season length is going to change if we're using the 79% criteria as a threshold for a high risk of fire. And then in this case, we're looking at 20 other models, and then this is just a ensemble mean and then the range across 150 years of simulation, and this is each of the year we're looking at the fire season length based on the 75% critical threshold. And in the RCP 8.5, again, looking at this one specific PFT, we see that the fire season length can increase from 135 days to 155 days at the end of the century. And then in the RCP 4.5, this is going to increase to close to 145 days. So last, but we still have looking at 10 to 20 days increase in terms of high risk fire season in the future. In the Chaparral specifically represented by Stone Range, the Chaparral ecosystem. And then another important part here, we're looking at what's the relative importance of different climate drivers. So what we're doing here is basically the including or excluding a certain climate drivers, for example, CO2 precipitation, humidity, temperature, and combination temperature and humidity. And what we found that we're looking at with no CO2, then the number of days actually going to be higher because the CO2 is going to reduce the amount of conductance. No temperature, the number of days going to, the fire season length is going to be lower. And it clearly can see that the first hypothesis is correct based on this simulation. The warming have much stronger impact compared to CO2 itself. The third hypothesis we looking at the combination of precipitation temperature and then individually. And it looks like it's not strong interaction impact here. Combined effect actually is not much larger than the individual effect here. So with that, I think we'd like to thank everybody on this paper and thanking the funding source from the Youth Lab to Fee program, where collaboration between University of California and the National Labs, and also the NG Tropic project for the FATES model. And also thank for all the authors here. Yeah, if you're interested, you can go through the paper at Biological Science, and also you can contact me with any additional questions. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Chongyang. I'm glad you were able to join us, and thanks everybody for sticking around. Since we're at time, I'm gonna pass it over to Will, but if you have questions, please go ahead and post them in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie, and thanks everyone for sticking around. The rest of the workshop's exciting. There's a couple sessions on climate justice, both this afternoon and I think on Thursday afternoon, that are kind of an exciting avenue for us to start pursuing. And there's a nice example, at least in both of those, of work that the land model working group's contributing to. So yeah, thanks for joining us today, and look forward to hearing more from you in the next weeks and months. Thanks, everybody.